The rain came down in slow grey sheets over Plumstead that autumn evening, and the gas lamps along the high street guttered in their iron cages. Inside a narrow chemist's shop, a woman in widow's black counted out coins on the wooden counter. Her name was Louisa Taylor. She asked, in a voice as soft as folded linen, for a small quantity of sugar of lead. The chemist wrapped the packet in brown paper and tied it with string. Outside, a hansom cab rattled past, and a boy called out the evening papers in the wet. Louisa slipped the packet into the pocket of her mourning cloak. She thanked him kindly. She turned toward the door, and somewhere across the town, in a low bed by a low fire, an old woman was already beginning to die. The quiet before the storm. Good evening, and welcome. Welcome to the Bedside Historian. The hour is late where I am sitting tonight, and the world beyond the window has folded itself away into its own hush. Somewhere in the house a clock is ticking, and somewhere further off a dog has stopped its barking, and there is nothing now between us and the long backward road of the past. I do not know where you are listening from tonight. Perhaps a bedroom in a city you have lived in your whole life. Perhaps a hotel room in a place you did not expect to be. Perhaps a long car journey, or a hospital chair, or a kitchen with the lights turned down while the kettle cools. Whatever the place, and whatever the hour on your side of the night, I am glad of the company. Before we begin, if you feel able to, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It costs you nothing at all, and it helps the channel more than I can properly say. It is how these long histories reach other listeners who cannot sleep, and it is how the candle stays lit. Now let us drift backward together. Let us leave the room you are in, and let us leave the year that we are in, and let us go down into a wet evening in the south of London in the autumn of 1882. The parish is called Plumstead. It sits on the south bank of the Thames, a little east of Woolwich, in that stretch of the city where the marshes give way to brickfields and the brickfields give way to terraces. In 1882, it is still half a village and half a suburb. There are market gardens at the edge of it, and there is a common where donkeys graze in the summer, and there is a slow smell of the river always in the air. The men of the parish work in the arsenal at Woolwich, or on the docks, or in the dockyard, and the women take in lodgers and washing and needlework, and the whole place is drawn together by the bell of St. Nicholas, and by the bell of St. Margaret, and by the low iron chime of the tram. I would like you to picture the evening as it was. The rain has been falling since the middle of the afternoon, in that thin, persistent way that London rain has when it means to last the night. The gas lamps along the high street have been lit early, because the sky has never really lifted, and the light of them shows yellow and wet on the paving stones. A hansom cab passes with its lamps burning. A boy in a wet cap calls out the evening papers from a doorway. The windows of the public houses are steaming from the inside, and the doors of the shops are shutting one by one as the shopkeepers turn their signs and count their takings. It is the ordinary end of an ordinary weekday, in an ordinary parish, in the greatest city in the world. We have to move for a moment from the street into a particular life. This is a habit I will fall into throughout the night. I will take you by the sleeve, and I will walk you from one room of the story into the next, and I will try never to leave you standing outside in the wet. The life we are walking into is that of a woman named Louisa Taylor. She is 36 years of age in this autumn, or perhaps a year or two either side of that. The parish records and the later court papers do not quite agree, and the truth is that a working-class woman of her sort left very few footprints in the paper of her century. What we can say is this. She had been born in the county of Kent, in a village not far from the coast. She had come up to London as a young woman, as so many young women did in those decades, when the countryside was thinning and the city was swelling. She had married. She had been widowed. She had married again. And she had been widowed again. By the autumn of 1882, she wore the black of a second mourning, and she had worn it long enough that the cloth had gone a little grey at the seams. The record does not tell us what she looked like with any real precision. One neighbour said afterwards that she was of middling height and middling build, with brown hair drawn back beneath her bonnet, and eyes that were neither pale nor dark. Another said she had a plain face and a pleasant voice. A third, who lived in the same row and had known her longer, said only that she was the sort of woman you would not turn to look at twice in the street, but that once she began to speak you noticed her, because her voice was low and even, and because she chose her words as if she were counting coins into a purse. That is all we have of her face. There is no photograph of her that I have ever been able to find, and if one existed, it has long since gone into the general dark of things. When I picture her in my own mind, I picture the voice first and the face second, and the face is always a little out of focus. She had a trade of a kind. She had worked as a domestic servant in her younger years, and she had worked in a laundry, and she had done a spell as a monthly nurse, the sort of woman a family would engage, in the weeks around a birth or an illness, to sleep in the house and tend the bed and warm the broth and change the linen. In an age before hospitals as we now understand them, before nursing had become the proper profession it was to become, the monthly nurse was a familiar figure in the lodging houses of a parish like Plumstead. She was not a doctor. She was not a trained sister of a hospital ward. She was a neighbour with a bag who knew how to fold a bandage and how to draw a poultice and how to sit up all night with a fever. Louisa Taylor was such a woman. She was known for it in the streets around William Street and Maxey Road, and she was called for when a lodger fell ill, or when an old woman took to her bed, or when a child would not stop crying in the night. She lived, in this autumn, in furnished rooms, moving every few months, as the working poor of London did, when the rent came due, or the landlady turned difficult, or the coal ran out. She had no children of her own who lived. The records suggest that there had been a child, or perhaps two, and that they had gone the way that so many children of that century went, into the little churchyards on the edges of the parish, with a stone if the family could afford one, and a wooden marker if it could not. Whether she grieved for them openly or in silence, no one wrote down. It is one of the things about her that we will never know, and we should sit with that unknowing for a moment, because there are a great many things about Louisa Taylor that we will never know, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. You do not, in a story of this sort, always start with the crime. You start with the ordinary weather of a life, because the crime, when it comes, has to grow out of that weather. So let us stay a little longer in the ordinary. Let us follow Louisa Taylor as she moves through her Plumstead evening. She has been out to the shops. She has a small basket over one arm, and in the basket there is a loaf, and a pat of butter wrapped in muslin, and a twist of tea, and a paper of tobacco for a lodger who has asked her to fetch it. She has been to the pawnbroker as well, because the widow's pension she draws from her second husband's friendly society does not stretch as far as she would like it to. She has pawned a small brooch that had been her mother's, a bit of jet on a silver pin, worth perhaps 5 shillings to the pawnbroker, and worth a great deal more than that to her, though she does not let the pawnbroker see her face when she hands it over. She has pawned other things before, in other months, and she has redeemed some of them and lost others. The little brass tickets are in a tin under her bed, in the room she is renting on William Street. The rain thickens as she turns off the high street. She pulls the morning cloak closer at the throat. She passes the corner where the boy is still calling out the papers, and she pauses a moment to buy one, because she likes to read the news of the town by the fire. She hands over a farthing. The boy touches his cap. She tucks the paper under her arm, and she walks on, in the yellow gaslight and the thin rain, down toward the low terraces of William Street, where the smoke of 100 chimneys is coming down almost to the level of the eaves because of the damp in the air. I want to pause here and say the thing that any honest teller of this story has to say. What I have just told you, the basket, the brooch, the paper, the farthing to the boy, is drawn together from what the neighbours later told the coroner, and from what the shopkeepers later told the police, and from the small, ordinary details of a Plumstead evening in that decade, which the newspapers of the parish preserved without ever knowing they were preserving anything at all. It is as close to a true picture of that walk home as I can honestly give you. But I have not been told, in any record, exactly what she was thinking as she walked. No one wrote down whether her mind was on the coming winter, or on a dead husband, or on the friend she was going home to, or on the small brown paper packet that would, in the weeks to come, be tucked away in a drawer. It is easy, telling a story like hers, to fill the silences with certainty, to say she was already planning, already calculating, already cold. I would rather not do that. The truth is that we have her footsteps, and we have her purchases, and we have her voice as her neighbours remembered it, and we do not have her mind. Let us stay with her then, only as far as the honest record will let us. She reaches the top of William Street. It is a short street of 2-storey brick cottages, each with a low iron railing, and a scrub of front garden, and a step scrubbed white with hearthstone, by whoever in the house is thought to be responsible for such things. Halfway down, on the left-hand side, there is a house where the curtains have been drawn early, and the lamp in the parlour is already lit against the wet. That is the house Louisa Taylor is walking to. In it there is an elderly woman named Mary Ann Tregillis, whom she has known for some years and calls a friend. In it, also, is Mary Ann's husband, a very old man named William Tregillis, who was once a policeman of the Metropolitan Force and is now half-blind and unsteady on his legs. They have taken her in as a lodger. She has taken them, in her turn, into the kind of care that the monthly nurse gives to the elderly and the ailing. We will come to that house, and to those people, and to the low bed by the low fire, in the chapters that lie ahead. For tonight it is enough that she is walking toward it in the rain. The bell of St. Nicholas begins to strike the hour, somewhere across the roofs of Plumstead, in that deep iron voice that London bells have always had. She counts the strokes without meaning to. She has always been the sort of woman who counts things, coins, minutes, doses, breaths. That habit will matter, later, more than she can know. Tonight it is only the harmless habit of a widow walking home in the wet, with a loaf under her arm, and a folded paper, and a mourning cloak going a little heavy in the shoulders from the rain. I would like, before we go any further into her story, to set one thing down between us as clearly as I can. This is not a story about a monster. It is a story about a woman, a real woman, who lived and breathed in a real parish of a real city, and who did a terrible thing in the ordinary rooms of ordinary friends, in a century that had not yet learned to see such things coming. The horror of what she did lies precisely in how quietly it grew out of a life like anyone else's. The whole slow arithmetic of it, the visits to the chemist's counter, the little packets of brown paper, the spoonfuls of broth carried up the narrow stair, will unfold before us over the hours to come, and it will unfold at the pace at which it truly happened, which is the pace of a long autumn turning into a long winter, in a South London parish in 1882. For now, the rain is still falling. The gas lamps are still burning yellow along the high street. The bell of St. Nicholas has finished striking. Louisa Taylor has reached the low iron railing of the house on William Street, and she has lifted the latch of the little gate, and she has stepped up onto the whitened step. The door will open in a moment. A voice will call to her from inside. A fire will be crackling in the parlour grate, and on the mantel, beside a chipped china dog and a framed print of the Queen, there will be a small tin box in which, in the days and weeks to come, a folded packet of brown paper will find its quiet resting place. A widow in mourning black. I want to take you back further still, if you will let me. Not so far as the pavements of Plumstead, and not as far as the house on William Street where the lamp is burning in the parlour, but into the earlier weather of Louisa Taylor's life, into the years before the second black dress, and before the friendship that would end a life. It is a country we can only walk through in the half-light. So little of it was set down that even her own name shifts a little from one page of the record to the next. She was born in the county of Kent, in a village whose name the parish books never quite agree upon, in the middle years of the 1840s. Her father was a labourer of the sort of Kentish family that had worked the hop gardens and the ploughland of the Weald for as long as anyone in the parish could remember. Her mother took in mending. There were other children, 5 or perhaps 6. The census taker never quite settled it, and the family kept a single room in a cottage on the edge of the common, where the rent was 5p a week, and the smoke from the fire went straight up through a hole in the thatch. The floor was of beaten earth. The bed was of straw and old blanketing. Louisa slept, in the earliest years anyone could remember of her, curled between two of her sisters at the foot of that bed, and she woke before dawn to the sound of her father putting on his boots for the fields. Two of her sisters did not live past the age of 5. A brother, older than she was, went out with the sheep at 9 and did not come back one winter evening. The record says only that he was found the next morning, and does not say what he was found of, and there is a stone in the churchyard that gives his name and his years and nothing more. Death sat at the elbow of a labouring family in that county in that decade, and it was accepted with the sort of stunned patience that the poor of the century learned early and never really unlearned. Whether the loss of those siblings marked Louisa in any particular way, no one has told us. We should be careful, in a story like this one, not to reach back and put a knife in a child's hand because we know what the woman will one day do. The little girl at the foot of the straw bed is not yet the widow in the mourning cloak. She is only cold in the winters and hungry in the springs, and taught by her mother to read the Sunday Psalms from a battered book that had been her grandmother's. She left the village at about the age of 14 or 15. Again, the record disagrees with itself, and again I would rather admit the disagreement than choose between them. She went into service, as a girl of her background almost always went, in the house of a farmer some miles off, and then in the house of a country clergyman in a nearby parish, and then, when she was old enough to make the journey, up to London. That last leg she made, so far as we can piece it together, by the branch line of the South Eastern Railway, in a third-class carriage with wooden benches, in a dress that had been given to her by the clergyman's wife, because the one she had was not fit for the city. She had, in the pocket of that dress, 7 shillings and 3p. She had a single change of linen tied in a square of cotton, and she had the name of a lodging-house in Deptford written down for her by the clergyman's wife on the back of a printed tract about temperance. Now let me step back with you for a moment. I said at the top of this hour that I would try never to leave you standing outside in the rain, and I mean to keep to that. What I have just told you, the 7 shillings, the tract on temperance, the third-class carriage, is stitched together from what the newspapers of the trial afterwards reported about her early life, and from what a woman who had known her in Deptford told a reporter for one of the Kentish weeklies when the story broke. Some of it I trust. Some of it I trust less, because reporters in the 1880s were not above filling in the picture of a condemned woman with details that read well in a Sunday paper. Where I am giving you something that comes from that later, less reliable stream, I will try to tell you so. Where the ground under our feet is firmer, I will not interrupt the telling. That is the fairest bargain I know how to make with you. To return, then, to the girl arriving in London. She reached the terminus at London Bridge, so the story goes, in the summer of the year 1861, when the city was in the last full flower of its mid-Victorian confidence, and the great glass palace at Sydenham was still the marvel of the age. She did not see the glass palace. She saw, instead, the smoke over the roofs of Southwark, and she smelt the tanneries on the south bank, and she made her way on foot down through Bermondsey and out toward Deptford, where the lodging-house on the tract turned out to be a rear kitchen in a court off Church Street, kept by a woman named Mrs. Beasley, who took in girls newly up from the country and put them out to service in the households of the parish. Louisa slept, for her first 3 nights in London, on a settle in that kitchen, wrapped in her travelling cloak, with the sound of the river through the open window and the sound of the docks not far beyond it. She was, by every account we have, a watchful girl in those first weeks, and a very fast learner of the ways of a city she had never seen. She took her first place as a housemaid in a merchant's house on Blackheath. She stayed there, or in another house very like it, for the better part of 6 years. In the 7th year she left service and went into a laundry. In the 9th year she left the laundry and, at about the age of 23, married her first husband. His name was James Roberts, or perhaps Robertson, The record here is unforgivably careless, and I have seen it written both ways in papers that ought to have known better. He was a young man employed in the yards at Deptford, and he was, by the recollection of a neighbour, a soft-spoken sort who liked a pipe by the fire and a walk on a Sunday. Louisa moved with him into 2 rooms above a chandler's shop on Prince Street. She kept the rooms very tidy. She hung a bit of white muslin at the window. She began, for the first time in her life, to save a little money in a stone jar on the mantel. He died in the 4th year of the marriage. The record says only that it was a fever, and does not say what kind, and does not say whether the doctor was called or not. The year was 1872, and fevers of every kind, typhus, typhoid, the continued fevers of the riverside, took working men out of their houses in Deptford by the hundred that winter. There is nothing in the account, and no whisper in the papers of the later trial, that has ever suggested that his death was anything but the ordinary death of a poor man in a bad winter. I say that plainly because I want you to hear it plainly. It is easy, when the ending of a story is a woman convicted of poison, to look backward and see a hand behind every earlier grave. In the case of James Roberts, or Robertson, of Prince Street, there is nothing at all in the record to suggest a hand. He died. She wore black. She sold the muslin at the window because she could no longer pay the rent on the rooms above the chandler's shop. She moved, then, into the rooms of a widow named Mrs. Halpin, in a court off the Broadway. She went back into work, first as a laundress and then, for the first time, as a monthly nurse. That trade suited her, or she suited it. She had a good hand with the sick. She could sit up all night without complaining. She did not spill the broth on the sheets. She did not talk when she was not wanted, and she talked, when talking was wanted, in that even voice we spoke of in the last hour, the voice that was said by everyone who ever mentioned it to be pleasant. She built up, in the parishes on the south side of the river, a slow reputation of the kind that a working woman had to build for herself if she meant to eat. We have to pause here again, because a great deal of what I have just said comes from the recollections of neighbours who were interviewed years later, and neighbours interviewed after a scandal are not always the same neighbours they were before it. Some of them, no doubt, remembered her honestly. Others, I suspect, remembered her the way the reporter wanted them to remember her. If a woman is going to hang, everyone she ever sat up with turns out, in the telling, to have found her a little strange even then. I do not think we should trust that entirely. I think we should hold, instead, to the plainer things, that she nursed the sick, that she was called for, that she was paid, that she moved from lodging to lodging as the work called her, and that in the parishes of Deptford and Greenwich and, later, Plumstead, her name became known in the way that any competent monthly nurse's name became known, by mouth, from one bedside to the next. In the year 1879 or 1880, the register is smudged in the parish book, and I have not been able to make out which of the two it is. She married again. This second husband was a man named Jacob Taylor. He was a good deal older than she was. He had been a coachman in the household of a Greenwich merchant, and he had retired on a modest annuity from the friendly society he had paid into all his working life. He was, by every account, a decent man, and he was besotted with her. They lived in furnished rooms in the parish of Greenwich, and then, when his health began to fail, in cheaper rooms in Deptford, and then, when the annuity had to stretch further, in still cheaper rooms across the river. He died in the autumn of 1881 of what the doctor called a general decline. The Friendly Society paid out its burial benefit. Louisa put on her mourning again. She was, at the age of 5 or 36, a widow for the second time. And here, at last, we come close to the point at which our earlier chapter began. She drew, from her second husband's society, a widow's pension of a few shillings a week. It was not enough to live on. It was not nothing, either. It was the sort of income that put a working widow at the ragged edge of respectability, enough to keep a bonnet on her head and a decent hem to her morning dress, and never quite enough to keep the coal in the scuttle through a whole week. She kept moving. She took a room in one parish, and then a room in another, and then a bed in a shared room with another widow, and then a room to herself again, and in every one of those rooms she left the walls a little cleaner than she had found them, and the ledger of the landlady a little emptier than the landlady had expected. She was not, so far as any complaint of the time survives, a troublesome lodger. She paid when she had it. She promised when she did not. The Mourning itself was a country of its own in that decade. Let me pause with you a moment and set out what the black on her shoulders would have meant to the eyes that saw her in the street. In the 1880s, a widow of her class was expected to keep to a first mourning of a year and a day, in bombazine or parramatta, with a heavy trimming of crepe, without ornament and without gloss. She was expected then to move into a second mourning of some further months, in which the crepe was gradually reduced and a little grey or violet was permitted to appear at the collar or the cuff. She was expected, only then, to leave off the black. This was the pattern of the respectable middling widow. For a poor widow, the pattern was the same in outline but shabbier in execution. One dress, worn and worn again, dyed at home if the colour began to fade, brushed by candlelight to keep the crepe from going brown at the shoulders where the sun caught it. When Louisa Taylor stepped into the chemist's shop in Plumstead in the autumn of 1882, the black she was wearing was the second mourning of her second husband, and the crepe at the cuffs had gone a little rusty, and the seams of the skirt had been let out and taken in more than once, and the bonnet on her head was the bonnet she had worn to Jacob Taylor's funeral in Greenwich 13 months before. She had, by that autumn, drifted eastward along the south bank of the river until she came to Plumstead. Why she came to that parish rather than another, no one has ever quite said. It may have been that the rents were softer there than in Deptford or Greenwich. It may have been that a friend of hers was in service in a house on the common, and had sent word that there was nursing work to be had. It may have been simply that a woman who has been moving from room to room for 2 years does not always know why she takes the omnibus one Wednesday morning and gets off at the stop she gets off at. What we do know is that in the early summer of 1882 she took a bed for a week in a lodging house in Maxey Road, and that she did nursing work in 2 or 3 houses in that street, and that in one of those houses she met, for the first time, an old woman named Mary Ann Tregillis, who was struggling that summer with a bad hip and a worse husband and a household run on very slender means. The friendship that began between them that summer is, in a way, the first true door of our story. I do not want to open it fully yet. It deserves an hour of its own, and it will have one. For tonight it is enough to say that the 2 women took to one another. Mary Ann liked the widow's even voice and her steady hands. Louisa, for her part, liked the fire in the parlour and the pot of tea always on the hob, and the way that old William Tregillis, half blind and unsteady, would nod off in his chair after supper and leave the 2 of them to talk in the firelight about the men they had buried and the parishes they had lived in and the price of coal that winter. And so the widow in her second mourning, with the crepe gone a little rusty at the cuffs, walked out of the lodging-house in Maxey Road one wet October afternoon, and she turned into William Street, and she lifted the latch of a gate she had lifted many times before, and she stepped up onto the whitened step of a house whose parlour lamp was already burning in the front window. The door opened. A voice called to her from inside, and the story, without her yet knowing it, and without the old woman by the fire yet knowing it, began its slow turn from friendship towards something else. The house on William Street. The house on William Street was not much to look at from the pavement. 2 stories of London brick, gone the colour of old tea in the wet, with a slate roof that had shed 1 or 2 tiles in a gale the previous winter, and never quite had them put back. A pair of front windows with lace curtains behind the glass. A door painted a dull olive green, with a brass knocker in the shape of a hand holding a wreath. A step scrubbed white with hearthstone by whoever was strong enough that morning to kneel to it. There were 4 such houses in the terrace, and this was the second from the corner, and if you had walked down William Street on a wet afternoon in the autumn of 1882, you would have passed it without a second glance. Let me take you inside for a while. Mind the step, because the flagstone dips a little in the middle, where 100 years of boots have worn it. The passage beyond the door is narrow enough that two people cannot pass in it without one turning sideways, and it smells at once of the coal in the parlour grate and of the camphor that Mary Ann Tregillis kept in a muslin bag in a drawer of the hall stand, on the belief that camphor kept off the rheumatism and the moth in equal measure. There is a strip of oilcloth on the floor, patterned in a faded imitation of a Turkey carpet. There is a hat and coat stand of dark bentwood with an umbrella missing two of its ribs. There is a barometer on the wall that has read, "Change." For as long as anyone can remember, the parlour opens off the passage on the right. It is a room of perhaps 12 feet by 10. The grate is of blackened iron with a hob at either side, and on the left-hand hob a tin kettle sits low over the coals from morning until night, so that a cup of tea is never more than the striking of a match away. Above the grate is a mantle of painted deal, and along the mantle are the ornaments by which a household of that class in that decade announced itself to the world. A pair of Staffordshire dogs, chipped at the ears. A framed print of the young Queen at her coronation, gone yellow behind the glass. A tin box that had once held tobacco, and now held pins and hair grips and the two brass keys of the coal cellar. A photograph, in a folding leather case, of a man in the tunic of the Metropolitan Police, taken about the year 1855, in which the man is standing very stiffly beside a studio table and holding his helmet against his hip. That man is William Tregillis, the master of the house, 30 years younger than he is on the October afternoon we are visiting him. He was born in the county of Cornwall, in a village near Camborne, in the last decade of the previous century. He had come up to London as a young man to look for work, and he had joined the Metropolitan Police in the year of its founding, or very nearly so, when Sir Robert Peel's new force was still being sworn in, and the constables of London were still being taught how to walk their beat. He had served for the better part of 30 years, first in the divisions of the West End, and then, when his knees began to give him trouble, in the quieter beats south of the river. He had retired on a small pension in the middle of the 1870s, and he had settled with his wife in the cottage on William Street, and he had begun the long descent into old age that had, by the autumn of 1882, left him at 78 or 79. The parish register is smudged, and I have never been certain which, half blind in the right eye, wholly blind in the left, and unsteady enough on his feet that he took a stick to the yard privy and a second stick to the parlour chair. Mary Ann was his junior by 7 or 8 years. She had been born in Bermondsey, the daughter of a leather dresser, and she had gone into service as a girl and then into the laundry trade, and she had married William Tregillis in the year 1852 at the parish church of St. Nicholas, Deptford. They had raised, between them, 3 children who lived, and buried 2 more who did not. The 3 who lived were grown and gone by the time our story finds them. A son was a foreman at the Woolwich Arsenal, and lived 2 streets away with a wife and 4 children of his own. The second son had gone for a soldier in India, and had not been heard of in 7 years. A daughter had married a bootmaker in Rotherhithe, and came across the river once a month with a basket of oranges and a small bottle of stout for her mother's cough. On the other Sundays, and on the long weekdays between the Sundays, the old couple were alone in the parlour on William Street, with the coals going down in the grate, and the kettle low on the hob, and the barometer still reading, "Change." I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of... It is easy, telling a story that will end where this one ends, to make the cottage sound sinister from the moment you step inside it. It was not sinister. It was the parlour of an old couple on a small pension, with the ordinary heaviness of the elderly upon it, the walk from chair to grate carried out with a stick, the reading of the newspaper carried out with a magnifying glass, the winding of the mantel clock carried out only by whoever remembered on a Saturday night to do it. The camphor in the hall-stand drawer was there because Mary Ann's hips were bad. The oilcloth on the passage floor was there because a carpet was beyond their means and their strength to beat. The lace at the parlour window was there because Mary Ann had been given it by her mother on her wedding day, 30 years before. It was when Louisa Taylor first stepped into it in the summer of 1882 an entirely ordinary room in an entirely ordinary house, and any horror that would later belong to it had not yet been carried across the threshold. Let us walk back with her now into that first visit. It was a Tuesday afternoon in July, so far as the neighbours could later fix it, and the weather was hot in the way that Plumstead in a dry July grew hot, the marshes to the east giving off a heavy smell, the pavements throwing up the heat of the morning, the flies bad at the windows of the butcher's shop on the high street. Louisa had been called in by a Mrs. Yardley of Maxey Road, who was a friend of Mary Ann's, to sit up 2 nights with Mrs. Yardley's mother, who was dying by inches of a growth in the throat. Mary Ann had come round on the Wednesday to sit with Mrs. Yardley for an hour, while Louisa took her supper, and the 2 women had met over a plate of bread and dripping at the kitchen table, and by the time Louisa left the house on the Thursday morning, Mary Ann had invited her to tea at William Street the following Sunday afternoon. She went. She sat in the parlour we have just described. Old William Tregillis was in his chair by the grate, with a red flannel wrapped about his neck for a chill he could not quite shake, and he took to her at once, because she spoke up loud enough for him to hear, and did not shout in his ear as some visitors did, and because she asked him, as if she truly wanted the answer, what year he had been sworn in, and what division he had walked. He told her. He told her a great deal. He told her about the beat he had walked in Bow Street in the 50s, and about the fog he had walked into one November morning on Waterloo Bridge, and about a burglary in a jeweller's off the Strand, in which he had lost the top of a finger, and he raised the hand, so the neighbour who was present later remembered, and showed her the joint where the finger had been taken off. She admired it. She admired him. Mary Ann poured out the tea, and by the end of that afternoon a friendship that would last until one of them was dead had opened its door on William Street and let itself in. She began, from that Sunday on, to call at the house 2 or 3 times in a week. She would bring, when she had it, a little pat of butter from the dairy on the corner, or a paper of tea, or a twist of tobacco for the old man's pipe. She would sit an hour by the grate. She would take the kettle off the hob when it began to sing, and pour a fresh cup for Mary Ann and a fresh cup for William. She would ask about the daughter in Rotherhithe. She would listen to the same 3 stories from the old policeman that she had listened to the week before, and she would listen to them as if she had never heard them, which is, in an old friend of the elderly, the rarest and kindest thing there is. Mary Ann began to look for her step in the passage. William began to nod off in his chair before her visits were over, because he trusted her to be in the room. The neighbours in the terrace, if they thought anything of it, thought that the old couple were fortunate in the widow they had drawn to themselves that summer. By the middle of September, the friendship had thickened into something more practical. Louisa had lost the room she had been renting in Maxey Road. The landlady, a Mrs. Blount, had decided to take back the room for her own married daughter, who was coming down from Norwich with a new baby, and she had begun, in the last week of August, to sleep on a made-up bed in the back parlour of the house on William Street. It was to be a temporary arrangement. Mary Ann had put it about the street that Louisa would be with them only for a fortnight or 3 weeks, until a fresh room could be found. In the event, the fortnight became a month, and the month became 6 weeks, and by the first cold of October there was no more talk of a fresh room, and the widow's box of belongings had been brought up from the passage and put in a corner of the back parlour, and the widow herself had taken over the small tasks of the household that Mary Ann's hips no longer let her do, the fetching of the coal from the cellar, the black leading of the grate, the walk to the chemist's on the high street for the drops that the doctor had prescribed for the old man's cough. You do not, in a household of that kind, ask a nurse to leave once she has begun to make herself useful. The rooms of a Plumstead cottage were not so full that a 4th pair of hands was not welcome in them. Mary Ann paid her, when she could, a shilling or 2 a week for the extra work. William, who had never been an easy giver of praise, took to calling her the girl, in that fond gruff way that old men have when they mean the opposite of the girl. Well, they gave her, at the beginning of October, her own drawer in the chest on the landing, in which she kept her handful of linen and the tin from under the bed, with the pawn tickets in it, and a folded packet or 2 of brown paper, that she had not yet had occasion to open. Here, once more, I want to be honest with you. The order and the pace of those weeks, the first tea, the first small kindnesses, the moving in of the box, the giving of the drawer, I have drawn together as faithfully as I can from what the neighbours in the terrace told the coroner in the November of that year, and from what Mrs. Yardley of Maxey Road told a reporter for one of the local weeklies in the December. The neighbours did not agree on everything. One remembered the first tea as having been on a Sunday, another as having been on a Saturday. One placed the moving in of the box in the last week of August, another in the first week of September. Where they disagreed, I have chosen the version that seemed to me the plainer, and I have not embroidered the versions that agreed. What is beyond disagreement is that by the middle of October 1882, Louisa Taylor was living in the house on William Street as a lodger and a nurse, and something very like a friend of the family, and Mary Ann Tregillis was pleased to have her there, and old William Tregillis, in his chair by the grate, believed her to be the best piece of good fortune that had come to his household in years. You do not always see, in the parlour of an old couple in a South London terrace, what is settling over the room while you sit in it. The fire went down in the grate on that October evening, as it had gone down on every October evening. The tin kettle sang on the hob. The barometer read, "Change." As it had read, "Change," for so long that no one in the house looked at it any more. Somewhere in the terrace a child was crying, and further off along the street a costermonger was calling out the last of his cabbages, and the yellow light of the parlour lamp fell across the oilcloth in the passage and lit the brass wreath on the front door knocker from the inside. Mary Ann sat in her low chair with a shawl of grey worsted about her shoulders. William sat in the chair opposite, with the red flannel still wound at his neck and the stick between his knees. And in the third chair, drawn a little closer than the visitor's chair usually was, sat the widow in the second mourning, with her hands folded in her lap, and her low voice going on in the room without hurry, and her eyes, when they moved, moving to the mantel, where the tin box of pins and hair grips stood beside the folded leather photograph of the young policeman on his stiff studio afternoon. The fire settled a little further into itself. Mary Ann's eyes were closing. William was already gone at his end of the hearth, his mouth a little open, the breath going in and out with the small rasp that had troubled him since Michaelmas. Louisa reached out, without rising, and lifted the kettle off the hob before it could burn dry. She set it down on the fender. She turned the wick of the lamp a fraction lower. She sat for a long while in the dimming parlour, and she listened to the two old breaths on either side of her, and she thought whatever it was that she was thinking, which the record does not tell us, and which we shall not pretend to know. Outside, in the street, the gas of the lamp on the corner was lit at last against the coming dark, and its yellow found the lace at the parlour window and made a pattern of it on the wall opposite, and the pattern shivered a little when a cart went past, and then it settled, and the parlour was very still. The kindness of the nurse. The illness that took hold of Mary Ann Tregillis that October was not a sudden thing. It came on in the way the ailments of elderly women so often came on in the terraces south of the river, a slower step on the passage flagstones one Wednesday, a cough held back through morning prayers the following Sunday, a plate of boiled mutton left half-eaten on a Tuesday supper, for the first time in anyone's memory. She had never been a heavy eater, but she had always finished what was set in front of her. When the plate went back to the scullery with the mutton untouched, the girl who came in on Mondays and Thursdays to help with the wash, a child of 14 from Brewer Street named Susan Coles, noticed and mentioned it later to her mother. That is how these things travelled in a terrace of that kind, from scullery to kitchen, to doorway to the woman 2 houses down. By the middle of the month, Mary Ann's illness had a little public of its own in William Street, and every wife in the terrace had a theory about what it was. Let me pause with you here before we step into the sick room, because I want you to hear what nursing meant in a working parish in the year 1882. This was long before the district nurse in her navy uniform was a common sight on a South London pavement, and longer still before the National Health had put anything at all on a working woman's shelf. If your mother fell ill in a terrace like the one on William Street, and if the doctor cost too much to be called in more than once or twice, the person who kept the sick body in the bed and the sick spirit in the room was almost always another woman. A neighbour, a daughter-in-law, a sister from 3 streets over, or, if you had a shilling or two a week to lay out, a monthly nurse who had made a name for herself in the parish. That woman fetched the water and the coal. She emptied the slops into the pail behind the yard door. She scrubbed the linen at the copper in the scullery and hung it on the rope across the passage. She spooned the broth. She sat up at night. She read aloud from the prayer book on the mantel, or she said the Lord's Prayer over the pillow, or she said nothing at all and only held the hand. Louisa Taylor took up every one of these offices in the house on William Street, and she took them up without waiting to be asked. That has been said of her by everyone in the terrace who was interviewed afterwards, and it is one of the few things about her that no one in that later season of newspaper interest tried to unsay. She rose before dawn. She raked the ashes from the parlour grate and laid a fresh fire with sticks she had split herself in the yard the evening before. She warmed a saucepan of milk over the coals for the invalid. She carried it up the narrow staircase on a japanned tray with a slice of thin bread and a spoonful of raspberry preserve from a jar Mary Ann's daughter had brought over from Rotherhithe in the summer. She helped Mary Ann up onto the bolster. She fed her when Mary Ann's own hands began to shake too badly to hold the spoon. The bedroom in which Mary Ann lay through those weeks was the smaller of the 2 upstairs, at the back of the house, above the scullery. It looked out over a strip of yard scarcely 6 paces across, and beyond the yard wall stood the back of a chandler's warehouse, whose blackened brickwork blocked the morning light and gave the room the perpetual dusk of an underlit chapel. There was an iron bedstead of the cheaper kind, painted a dull rust-brown, with brass knobs at the 4 corners. There was a horsehair mattress under a cotton tick, and on the tick a straw palliasse for warmth. There was a patchwork quilt Mary Ann had stitched herself from cuttings of her daughter's schoolroom pinafores 20 years before. There was a washstand of stained deal with a china jug and basin patterned in a faded blue willow. There was a chair for the nurse to sit in. There was a candlestick of pewter on the little table beside the bed, and a box of vestas beside the candlestick, and a folded handkerchief on the table, and, from the 2nd week of the illness onwards, a bottle of dark glass with the label of a Woolwich chemist gummed to its neck. The bottle held, so the doctor believed, a mixture of magnesia and rhubarb for the settling of the stomach and the easing of the bowels. That is what he had written on the label, and that is what he had told Mary Ann when he called on her one wet Thursday afternoon in the middle of October and left the bottle on the table by the bed. His name was Dr. Saunders. He was a man of near 60, with white side whiskers and a hard round belly under his black frock coat, and he had a busy practice on the High Street that ran up as far as Woolwich Common and down as far as the marshes at Erith. He charged 2 shillings and 6pence for a house call within Plumstead parish, and 3 shillings if he had to come out beyond the railway line. He listened to Mary Ann's chest through a wooden stethoscope. He felt her pulse at the wrist. He said the trouble was a general weakening of the constitution, common in a woman of her years, and that a nourishing diet and a little of the magnesia and rhubarb at bedtime would do more for her than anything else he could think to prescribe. He did not, I should say plainly, look for anything else, and there is no reason in the record to suppose that he ought to have looked for anything else at that stage. Mary Ann was a woman past her middle 60s with bad hips and a long history of bronchial trouble in the winters, and the picture she presented on that Thursday afternoon was not the picture of anything a country doctor of the 1880s would have thought to test for. He wrote out his short prescription. He accepted his 2 shillings and 6pence from Louisa's hand at the parlour door. He put his tall hat on his head. He walked back down the wet pavement of William Street to his gig. He did not come again for 11 days. In those 11 days, the routine of the house folded itself around the sick-bed. Louisa was on her feet from 5:30 in the morning to 11 at night, and often longer than that. She took the coal in from the cellar in a scuttle of blackened tin. She boiled the kettle over the parlour grate for the invalid's tea. She made at midday a broth of neck of mutton and a handful of pearl barley and a carrot from the barrow on the corner, and she strained it through a piece of muslin so that only the clear amber liquor went up the stairs on the japanned tray. She spooned it into Marianne between the pillows. She wiped Marianne's mouth with a cloth wrung out in warm water. She combed the grey hair back from Marianne's forehead with a comb of tortoiseshell that had been a wedding present from a sister long dead. In the afternoon, when Marianne slept, she carried the linen down to the scullery and worked the copper. In the evening, she sat by the bed with the prayer book open on her lap and read aloud from the Psalms, in that even voice of hers that the neighbours had all remarked on, until the invalid's eyes closed and her breathing settled into the shallow rasp of a troubled sleep. Old William Tregillis, half blind in the chair beside the parlour grate, was in no state to see any of this clearly, but he heard it. He heard the widow's tread on the stairs at 5:30. He heard the clink of the poker on the grate. He heard the copper being lit in the scullery. He heard the murmur of the reading from the room above his head, at 9 and at 10 and at 10:30 in the evening. William had been a policeman for 30 years, and a policeman learns to trust the ordinary sounds of a house at night and to sit up in his chair at the ones that do not belong. Nothing about the sounds coming down through the boards from his wife's room struck him as out of place. The widow was doing, so far as his old ears could tell him, exactly what the widow ought to have been doing, and she was doing more of it than any daughter or hired nurse he had ever met in the parish had ever done. The neighbours said so too, and they said it warmly. Mrs. Yardley of Maxey Road, who had first brought the two women together over the plate of bread and dripping in her mother's kitchen back in July, came round on a Saturday afternoon with a jar of calf's foot jelly and stood in the parlour 10 minutes talking with Louisa, and she went home and told her husband over supper that if she was ever laid up in her own bed, she hoped there would be a woman like Mrs. Taylor to sit up with her. Mrs. Coles from Brewer Street, the mother of the girl Susan, said much the same thing at her washtub on the Monday. The wife of the son at the Woolwich Arsenal, a woman named Emma Tregillis, who called at the house every Sunday afternoon with the 4 children scrubbed and combed for the visit, spoke of the widow in glowing terms to her own mother on the Wednesday, and her mother spoke of the widow in glowing terms to the woman who did her washing on the Friday, and by that means the good name of Louisa Taylor moved out across the parish in the way that reputations moved in a place of that kind, from ear to ear, over the wash-line and the front step and the parish pump. You must hear that praise for what it truly was. It was not the hollow praise of gossips reaching for a phrase. It was the praise of hard, tired women who had themselves sat up with sick mothers and sick husbands and sick children through the long nights of a working life, and who knew, better than anyone, what the labour of a real nurse looked like from the outside. They saw Louisa fetching the coal at 6 in the morning. They saw the sheets on the line in the yard by 9. They saw the candle burning at the back bedroom window at 11 at night. They saw a widow, not much better off than they were themselves, giving to an old woman who was not her own mother a devotion that many a real daughter did not give. And they blessed her for it, in their kitchens and over their tea, and they meant every word of it. I want, before we go any further, to say something plainly. What I have just described is nursing. Real nursing. The lifting and the wiping and the wringing out of cloths in warm water and the reading of psalms by candlelight. Whatever else Louisa Taylor was, and whatever else she was to become before this hour is over, she was in those first weeks of October a real nurse to Marianne Tregillis, and the kindness of her hands was not invented by the neighbours who spoke of it. It was seen, and it was done well. I say that not to soften what is coming. I say it because it is true, and because a story that does not hold the true things in it, alongside the terrible ones, is not worth the telling. The same hands that spooned the broth to Marianne's lips were the hands that had, by then, already begun to add something else to the bottle on the bedside table. Both of those things are true at once. That is the difficulty, and the darkness of Louisa Taylor. The record does not tell us the day, or even the week, on which the first grain of the second thing entered the bottle. It does not tell us whether the decision was slow or sudden, whether it was made in the scullery over the copper, or in the yard at dusk with the sky the colour of a bruise, whether it was made at all in the way we mean when we use the word decision, or whether it accumulated in her the way rust accumulates on a hinge, unnoticed until the hinge will not turn. All the record tells us is that by the last week of October 1882, the packets of brown paper in her drawer on the landing had begun to be untied, and that a very fine dusting of white crystalline powder had begun to find its way into the mixture of magnesia and rhubarb on the little table beside the bed, and that Mary Ann Tregillis had begun to complain, when she was well enough to complain of anything, of a strange metallic sweetness at the back of her tongue that no amount of tea would carry away. Louisa carried the empty medicine bottle down the stairs on the last day of that month, and she wrapped it in a clean square of newspaper, and she put on her bonnet and her mourning cloak with the rusted crape at the cuffs, and she stepped out onto the whitened step of the house on William Street and pulled the olive-green door shut behind her. The afternoon was cold, and the light was already beginning to go out of the sky over the marshes. A boy with a barrow of chestnuts was calling from the corner of the high street. A dray was going by with a load of empty barrels for the brewery at Erith. The gas lamps had not yet been lit. Louisa turned her step toward the chemist's shop 3 streets away, where a man in a white apron would presently look up from his ledger and smile at the widow he had begun to know by sight, and reach down from a high shelf the wooden drawer in which he kept the white paper packets tied with fine cotton string. The chemist's counter. The chemist's shop stood on the corner of Herbert Road and Sandy Hill Lane, one of 4 such shops within a mile of the house on William Street, and by the last week of October 1882, Louisa Taylor had been in every one of them. There was Mr. Cheeseman's on the High Street, with its 2 front windows crowded to the glass with glass jars of coloured water and its brass mortar hanging above the door on a length of chain. There was Baker and Rivers up beyond the railway bridge in Woolwich, a well-kept establishment with a mahogany counter and a young assistant in shirt-sleeves who called every customer "Madam," whether or not she deserved it. There was a lesser place, kept by a widower named Yardley, at the far end of Maxey Road, which smelled always of dried lavender and the pipe tobacco of the owner. And there was the shop on the corner of Herbert Road, kept by a Mr. Kimberley, with its long, low counter of scrubbed pine and its wooden drawers along the back wall, labelled in a spidery hand with the Latin names of what they held. Louisa knew them all. She had been into each of them at least once in the fortnight past, and she had been into Mr. Kimberley's the most. I want to walk you through the door of that last shop with her, if you will let me, because it is important that you see clearly the counter across which one of the plainest transactions of this whole story was carried out. The door is of a dark varnished wood, with a pane of frosted glass at eye height, on which the words H. Kimberley, Chemist, are painted in a curving gold script that has begun to flake at the corners. The step below is of worn York stone. When you push the door inward, the bell above your head gives a thin, apologetic chirp. Inside, the shop is narrower than you would guess from the pavement, perhaps 10 paces from door to counter, and the ceiling is a good foot lower than the ceilings of the parlours in the terrace outside. The floorboards are of pine, sanded pale by feet and by scrubbing, and there is a fine grit of blown coal dust in the corners that even the sweepings of a morning cannot quite remove. The whole room smells of things I do not know the names of, and of things I do, of camphor, of dried peppermint leaf, of the metallic ghost of a spilled iodine bottle, of the sweetness of gum arabic, and, over all of it, of the tallow of the 2 candles that were kept burning at either end of the counter through the shorter days of autumn. Along the wall behind the counter stood the drawers. There were 84 of them, in a grid of 6 across by 14 down, each about the size of a folded handkerchief, and each faced with a brass ring pull. Above the ring pull, on a card slipped into a tin frame, was written the name of what the drawer held. Rad. Ray. For rhubarb root. Fol. Sene. For senna leaf. Sulph. zinc. For the sulfate of zinc. And in the third row down and the fourth drawer across from the left, on a card that had been in its frame for perhaps 20 years and had gone the colour of weak tea, the words, plum, asset. For the acetate of lead, the sugar of lead of the ordinary trade, the substance we have already followed in and out of the pocket of Louisa's mourning cloak more than once in this hour. Now let me be honest with you about the trade in that drawer, because a listener who does not know the England of the 1880s may be picturing something rather different from what stood there. Lead acetate in that year was not a hidden thing. It was not a sinister thing. It was a chemical of 100 everyday uses, and it stood on the shelves of every chemist's shop from Aldgate to the outer edge of the county. Dyers bought it to fix colour in the printed calico of a working woman's dress. Milliners bought it for the setting of certain feathers. Cabinet makers used a weak solution of it in the finishing of walnut and rosewood. Physicians of the older school prescribed it, in very fine doses, as an astringent for the flux and for the raising of blood, and it was written down in the pharmacopoeia of the day with no more caution about it than was set beside any other of the strong drugs the profession then trusted. It had a sweet taste, from which its common name had come. It was cheap, and under the Pharmacy Act of 1868, though it was listed in the second schedule of the poisons, its sale did not by law require the entering of the buyer's name in a book, so long as the buyer was known to the chemist, or introduced to him by a third party the chemist trusted. Louisa Taylor was, by the last week of October, entirely known to Mr. Kimberley by sight. She had come in for the first time on a wet afternoon in the middle of the month, and she had asked, in that even low voice of hers that never carried further than the length of the counter, for 2 ounces of the sugar of lead. She had said, when he asked her the question he was in the habit of asking, that she wanted it for the dyeing of a length of black bombazine she was making up into a second mourning for herself. That was a reasonable answer to give in a widow's dress in Plumstead in 1882, and Mr. Kimberley had no cause at all to doubt her. He had opened the third drawer down, and the fourth across. He had taken up his brass scales from beside the ledger. He had lifted a square of white paper from the pile beside the scales. He had tapped the crystals into the pan of the scale from a horn spoon until the needle stood true against the 2-ounce weight. He had folded the paper into a neat packet with the ends tucked in so that not a grain would spill on the way home. He had tied it round with a length of fine cotton string. He had written, Plum, Asset, 2 Oz, on the outside of the paper in pencil, and he had handed it across the counter, and she had put down her 2pence, 3 farthings on the wood. He had done the same thing on a Thursday of the following week, and again on the Monday after that, and again on the Thursday of the week after. 4 visits within a fortnight to the corner of Herbert Road and Sandy Hill Lane, each for 2 ounces of the same white salt, each paid for out of a leather purse she wore on a cord about her neck under her bodice. There is a question I have never quite been able to answer from the record, and I will put it to you plainly rather than pretend I have. Did Mr. Kimberley wonder? Did he wonder, on the 3rd visit, why a woman would need 6 ounces of the acetate of lead in a fortnight for a length of bombazine that could not have taken more than 1.5 ounces at the outside to fix its colour? He was asked that very question in the witness box at the Old Bailey 2 months later, and his answer, which is in the trial papers, was that he had not wondered. He had thought her a decent, respectable widow. He had thought that perhaps she had spoiled the first attempt and was starting again. He had thought 100 ordinary daily things that a busy chemist thinks in the course of a working day, and none of them had caused him to reach for the leather-bound book at his elbow, in which the law of 1868 permitted him to note down her name if he had wished. He had not wished. He had thanked her for her 2pence 3 farthings, and he had touched his forehead to her as she left, and he had turned to serve the next customer, which was a girl of 10, with a note from her mother, asking for a pennyworth of glycerine for a chapped hand. Come away from Mr. Kimberley's for a moment, and walk with me the 1.25 miles up to the Arsenal wall at Woolwich, because I want you to see the second shop she went into. Baker and Rivers stood in the long straight run of Powis Street, halfway between the market and the great gates of the arsenal itself, and it was a shop of a different order altogether from the corner shop on Herbert Road. It was double-fronted, with 2 plate-glass windows that were washed twice a week by a boy on a ladder. The counter within was of polished mahogany 2 inches thick, and behind it stood a cabinet of drawers reaching almost to the plaster ceiling, with a wheeled ladder on a brass rail so that the assistants could climb to the topmost ones without a stretch. The young man in shirt-sleeves I have already mentioned was named Alfred Halkett, and he was the youngest apprentice in the shop. He was a boy of 19 from the north of London, sharp-eyed and civil, with the beginnings of a moustache above his upper lip, and an ambition to keep a shop of his own in Islington in a few years' time. He served Louisa on 2 occasions. The first was in the 2nd week of October, when she asked him for an ounce of the sugar of lead, and he weighed it out for her without a word, because his master was watching from the far end of the counter, and the master had already served her once the previous morning. The second was on the 26th of the month, when she came in about 4 in the afternoon, with the light going low over Powys Street, and asked for 2 ounces this time, and he weighed those out too, and he wrote her sale in the day-book as 2 Oz. Plum. Asset. Cash. Widow in mourning. No name given. Because that was what the day-book required him to do. He did not, on either occasion, feel any misgiving. He did not, so he said at the trial, remember her particularly at all, until the papers in the December carried her likeness on the front page. That is one of the terrible truths of this story, and there is no way round it. In a parish the size of Plumstead and Woolwich together, with its dozen chemists strung along a mile of main road, a woman with a shilling to spend a week and a plausible tongue in her head could buy in 10 days more of the acetate of lead than she could ever have needed in a lifetime of honest dying. No single shopman saw the whole of what she bought. No single shopman had any cause to enter her name in the book, because no single shopman ever saw her twice in the same week at the same counter. Between Mr. Kimberley on Herbert Road, and Baker and Rivers on Powys Street, and Mr. Cheeseman on the High Street, and old Mr. Yardley on Maxey Road, the widow with the low voice and the second mourning was a face they knew, if they knew her at all, only as one of the 20 or 30 faces they served in an afternoon. The law of 1868 was not written for a woman like Louisa Taylor. It was written for the poisoner the lawmakers could imagine, which was a man in a hurry buying arsenic at a single shop on a single afternoon. It was not written for the patience of a widow across a fortnight of shops. You do not, I think, need me to describe every one of those visits to you. The pattern was the same each time. The bell above the door, the chirp of it, the step onto the pine floor, the low voice at the counter, the chemist's spoon at the drawer marked plum, acid, the brass scale, the folded packet of white paper tied with fine cotton string, the pushing of the coppers across the wood, the touching of the chemist's forehead, the bell again going the other way as the door swung shut. It is the ordinariness of it that must be kept before you. There was nothing sinister in the shops. There was nothing sinister in the men behind their counters. There was nothing, even, that a well-drilled watcher standing on the pavement outside could have called out as strange, because everything that Louisa Taylor did on those 4 afternoons in October she did within her rights as a subject of the Queen and a customer of an English tradesman. She walked home, on the last of those afternoons, along the wet pavement of the High Street with the packet safe in the inside pocket of her mourning cloak. The lamps had just been lit against the coming dark. A cold wind was coming up off the marshes to the east, and it took the smoke from the chimneys along the street and pressed it down onto the roofs of the houses in flat grey ribbons. She passed the butcher's shop, which was already putting up its shutters for the night. She passed the doorway of the public house on the corner of Maxey Road, from which a warm yellow light and the smell of ale and sawdust came out onto the pavement. She turned the corner into William Street. And in the front window of the second house from the end of the terrace, the parlour lamp was already burning behind the lace, and casting its yellow pattern out onto the shining slate of the pavement, and waiting for her. The slow poison. I want you to sit with me for a moment before we go back up the stairs of the house on William Street, because what happens in the room above the scullery over the next 3 weeks is a slow thing, and a slow thing is the hardest thing in the world to tell honestly. A murder in a single blow is a terrible sentence to write, but it is one sentence. A murder spread across 22 days, in spoonfuls of a bedside mixture, in a bedroom that smelled of camphor and coal smoke and clean linen, and carried out by hands that also washed the sheets and combed the hair and turned the pillow so its cool side lay under the cheek. That is not one sentence. That is a long, slow, unbearable arithmetic. And I want you to see the arithmetic as the parish saw it, which is to say without seeing it at all, and then I want you to see it as the post-mortem saw it later, which is to say with a lantern held very close. Mary Ann Tregillis had known, from the first evening the strange sweetness came into the back of her mouth, that something in the mixture beside her bed had changed. She had not been able to say what. She had not been well enough to hold the thought for long. She had turned it over between the pillows on a Wednesday, and again on a Friday, and again on a Sunday when the church bells were coming faint across the wet roofs from St. Nicholas at the top of the hill. She had wanted, once, to ask the doctor about it when he came, but the doctor came only on the 11th day, and by the 11th day the sweetness at the back of her mouth had become so ordinary to her that she no longer thought of it as strange. Illness does that. It takes a wrongness and folds it, patiently, into the shape of the day, until the sufferer no longer remembers what a mouth is meant to taste of when nothing has been put in it. I have never been able to work out from the record whether Mary Ann suspected. I will tell you that plainly. There is a letter written from her bed in the 2nd week of November, dictated to Louisa herself and posted to the daughter in Rotherhithe, in which she speaks of a burning about the wrists and a weakness in the legs and a taste that will not lift. And there is a note in the doctor's own hand from a call he made on the 7th of November, in which he records that his patient told him she had begun to see the walls of the bedroom pulse a little in the corners of her eye when the candle was carried past. There is nothing else. There is no letter she asked to write in her own hand. There is no whispered complaint to a neighbour at the front door. There is no plea to the daughter to come and take her home. If she suspected in a silence she took with her to the grave, and I would rather leave that silence intact than fill it with a guess of my own. Let me take you into the room. It is the 3rd of November, 1882. The rain has not stopped for 4 days. The strip of yard behind the scullery is standing in an inch of black water, and the water is catching the sky between the chimney pots and holding it upside down between the drain and the wall. In the back bedroom above the scullery, Mary Ann lies on the horsehair mattress, with the patchwork quilt drawn up to her chin. The fire in the small iron grate is very small, a scrape of coals and a broken elm stick sputtering at the front of it, because the coal in the cellar has begun to run down, and Louisa has been mean with it, so she says, until Emma from Woolwich can bring another sack on the Sunday. Mary Ann's face against the bolster has gone the colour of the tallow of the candle beside the bed, which is to say a bad yellow with no pink in it. Her lips have begun to line themselves with a fine grey rim that was not there a fortnight ago. Her hands, laid on the outside of the quilt where Louisa has folded them, are still the hands of a working woman of 68, with the veins standing high across the back and the knuckles thickened by half a lifetime at the wash-tub, but at the ends of the fingers and under the beds of the nails a slow blueness has begun to gather. It is the colour of the ink of a schoolboy's copybook diluted in water, and it has been there since the last day of October. Dr. Saunders, at his one call in that stretch of days, saw the blueness at the nails and put it down to the chill of the room and the poor circulation of an elderly heart. He said as much to Louisa in the parlour before he left. He was not a bad physician, Dr. Saunders. He was a country practitioner of his generation, doing the honest work of his generation, and lead poisoning by domestic administration was not a thing he had ever met in a working parish south of the river in 3 decades of practice. Poisoning by household lead was a hazard of certain trades: the paint mixers, the men who made shot at the top of the tall towers, the women who tinned the pans of a bad manufactory, and it presented in those trades in ways he knew from his textbook of Dr. Christison. It did not, in his experience, present at the bedside of a respectable widow in the back bedroom of a policeman's cottage. He gave Mary Ann a little laudanum for the pain about her wrists and the burning in her calves. He renewed the standing prescription of magnesia and rhubarb for the settling of the stomach. He accepted his half-crown at the parlour door. He touched his hat to Louisa. He went out into the rain. The mixture of magnesia and rhubarb, of course, was no longer only the mixture of magnesia and rhubarb. It had not been that thing for 11 days. Somewhere between the copper in the scullery and the japanned tray on the landing, on a schedule known only to herself, Louisa had begun to fold into it, with a horn spoon kept on a shelf in the pantry behind a jar of pickled onions, a very fine measure of the white salt from the folded paper packets in the drawer of the little chest on the landing. She did not, and this is one of the things the trial would establish, put in a great deal at any one time. She put in enough. Enough is a small word, but in the arithmetic of a slow poison, it is the only one that matters. Dr. Christison, in the same textbook Dr. Saunders had on his shelf, had written a generation before that the acetate of lead in doses of even 1 grain a day, repeated over weeks, would carry a robust adult to the graveyard by degrees so gradual that the household would swear on their Bibles the patient had died of the natural weakening of age. That was the arithmetic that was being worked at the bedside on William Street in the first fortnight of November 1882. It was worked without a raised voice. It was worked without a struggle. It was worked with the same tortoiseshell comb going patiently through the grey hair on the pillow, and the same even voice reading aloud from the Psalms at 9 o'clock in the evening. I want to describe, because it is important to hear this told plainly and without any elaboration of horror, what the symptoms of that poisoning were as they showed themselves in Mary Ann's body across those days. There was the sweetness at the back of the mouth, which came first and stayed. There was, next, a dulling of the appetite, so that even the clear amber broth of an afternoon was left at the side of the plate. There was a persistent thirst that no cup of water would settle. There was a griping about the belly, low down and to the left, that began in the 2nd week, and never afterwards went entirely away, and that Mary Ann described to her daughter in that dictated letter as a hand of a very cold sort taking hold of me every hour or two and then letting go. These. There was the burning about the wrists and the weakness in the calves that had made her mention the walls to Dr. Saunders. There was a slow constipation which set in about the 10th day, and against which the rhubarb in the mixture was now working uselessly in a losing skirmish. There was, in the 2nd week, a fine grey line beginning to appear along the edge of the gums where they met the teeth, a line that a physician trained in the industrial ailments of the north would have recognised in a moment as the classical marker of chronic lead in the body, and that a country doctor in a South London parish did not. There was, in the 3rd week, the blueness at the nails. There was, running under all of it, an exhaustion so heavy that on some mornings Mary Ann could not lift her own arm from the quilt to take the cup of tea Louisa held to her mouth. You will notice that I have not said what she thought of. You will notice too that I have not said what her dreams were, and what passed behind her closed eyelids in the long afternoons when she slept, and what she said to her husband when he came, unsteady and half-blind, up the narrow stairs once every 2nd day, to sit for a quarter of an hour at the foot of the bed and hold her toes through the quilt, in a shy tenderness he had never had the language for, even when he was a young constable. I have not said those things because they are not in the record, and because I made you a promise at the beginning of this production that I would not put words into a mouth that never spoke them. What is in the record is a body and a bottle, and the routine of a bedside carried on with a devotion the neighbours praised, without knowing that the devotion itself was the delivery system of the crime. Come out into the passage with me for a moment, and stand at the head of the stairs, and let me show you the small chest of drawers on the landing outside the bedroom door, because it is the most important piece of furniture in the house, and there is very little written about it. It is a piece of no distinction whatever. 3 drawers of stained pine, with brass handles of a cheap stamped pattern, standing on 4 turned feet that have gone loose in their sockets and rock a little when a door on the landing is closed. On the top of it stands an oil lamp with a globe of milk glass and a cracked china dish for a used Vesta. The lowest of the 3 drawers is filled with sheets and pillow slips being aired for the sick bed below. The middle drawer holds a folded pair of William's police trousers he will never again put on, and a small wooden box of odd buttons. The top drawer, which has a small brass keyhole but has never been fitted with a lock, holds a hairbrush, a bottle of camphor liniment, a paper of pins, a sheaf of receipted bills tied with red tape, and, at the very back on the right-hand side beneath the pins, 4 folded packets of white paper tied with fine cotton string, each about the size of a folded handkerchief, each with the letters Plum, Acid. Written in pencil on the outside in the spidery hand of Mr. Kimberley of Herbert Road. That is where the second thing lived. That is where it was kept between the visits to the bedside. It was not hidden in the cellar. It was not buried in the yard. It was in the top drawer of a chest on the landing, along with the pins and the paper of receipted bills, in a house where William Tregillis was too blind to see it, and where no one but Louisa Taylor ever put a hand. The neighbours, as I have already told you, went on speaking well of her all through those weeks. Mrs. Yardley of Maxey Road came again on the Saturday, with a piece of boiled ham and a bottle of milk stout, and she went home and told her husband that the widow was working herself into an early grave for the sake of old Mrs. Tregillis, and would be all skin and bone before the month was out. Mrs. Coles from Brewer Street sent Susan across with a jar of blackcurrant preserve on the Monday, and Susan came back with a message from Louisa that Mrs. Tregillis was no better, but was bearing it very patiently. Emma from Woolwich, coming with the 4 children on the Sunday afternoon, sat with her mother-in-law for half an hour, and held the old woman's hand, and afterwards said in the parlour, in a low voice, that the widow was not meant to hear but did, that Mrs. Taylor was a saint, and that she did not know what the family would do without her. Louisa answered, with the polite modesty of a woman who has been praised beyond her strength, that she was only doing what any Christian would do for a friend, and would Emma take a cup of tea before she went home in the rain. I sat, once, with the transcript of Emma's evidence at the Old Bailey open on a table under a green library lamp, and I read those 2 sentences a good many times over. A saint. What the family would do without her. Emma spoke them, on that Sunday afternoon in the parlour, over the head of a woman who at that very hour had 4 folded packets of the acetate of lead in a drawer on the landing above them, and had already put enough of the same salt into the bottle on Mary Ann's bedside table to guarantee that the next Sunday would find the old woman a shade nearer the grave than this one. Both women were telling the truth as they saw it. Emma was telling the truth of a daughter-in-law grateful beyond words to the neighbour who had lifted the burden of nursing off her own back. Louisa was telling the truth of a woman practised, by that stage in her life, in giving the answer a room wanted to hear. That both truths were spoken in the same parlour, over the same tea, out of the same pot, is one of the things about human beings that a long life of reading their histories has never quite let me get used to. By the 20th of November, the blueness at Mary Ann's nails had crept upward as far as the first joint. By the 22nd, the grey line at her gums was plain to any candle held close, though no one had yet held a candle close enough to see it. By the 24th she could no longer sit up unaided to take the broth from the spoon, and Louisa had begun to feed her lying flat on the pillow with a folded towel under her chin. By the 26th she was sleeping the greater part of the day, and waking only long enough to take a few sips of water. The candle by her bed burned lower every night. The rain, which had lifted for a stretch of days in the middle of the month, came back on the evening of the 28th, and hissed again against the small square of window above the yard. And it was on that evening, with the wind coming up cold off the marshes and the tallow of the candle guttering in a draught from under the door, that old William Tregillis, feeling his careful way up the narrow stairs, and taking his place for his quarter of an hour at the foot of the bed, laid his stiff hand on his wife's foot through the quilt, and heard her breathing, and did not, for the first time in the 41 years of their marriage, feel entirely certain of what he was hearing. The suspicions of a husband. Let me sit for a moment with William Tregillis, if you will let me, because he is the figure in this whole story who has been standing longest in the shadow of the lamp, and I have never been altogether at peace with how the history has treated him. The books that carry the name of Louisa Taylor forward into our own time give him a line or two in passing, and then they turn back to the widow at the bedside, as though he were only a piece of the parlour furniture. He was not. He was a man of 69 years, retired 11 years out of the Metropolitan Force, and though his eyes had gone almost entirely against him in the last of those years, the habit of noticing that had kept him in a uniform coat for 3 decades had not gone anywhere at all. It was still there under the shabby waistcoat and the frayed collar. It waited. It listened. And in the fortnight I am about to describe to you, it began, in the way of an old dog lifting its head at a footstep it half recognises, to stir. The first thing William noticed was the coppers. He kept his money, in the way of men of his generation and his station, in a leather purse of red morocco worn almost through at the corners, which stood upon the shelf of the parlour chimney between a spare pipe and the framed print of the Queen. Into this purse each week came the 12 shillings and sixpence of his police pension, paid to him in silver at the receiving office in Woolwich, by a clerk who had known him as a constable, and who touched his hat to him at the counter. Out of it, across the week, came the money for the coal and the bread and the tea and the tallow, and the twopence for the newspaper, on a Wednesday afternoon, that Emma's boy came round to read aloud to him. William could no longer count the money by sight. He counted it by touch. He had taught himself, in the years since the whitening had begun in the middle of his right eye, to know a florin from a shilling by the weight of it in the palm and by the milled edge under the ball of the thumb, and he could tell a penny from a halfpenny in the dark of a coat pocket by the size of the disc. It was the kind of small competence a man clings to when the greater ones have gone. On the 8th of November he took the purse down from the shelf to give a shilling to the boy from the bakery, and the weight of the purse in his hand was wrong. He did not, at that moment, know what he thought about it. He knew only that the leather had risen up into his palm too easily. He gave the boy the shilling. He put the purse back on the shelf. He sat down in his chair beside the fire, and he thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. Come away from him for a moment. I want to tell you plainly what the record shows and what it does not, because the truth of William Tregillis is that he was working almost entirely from feeling, and feeling is the thing the historians have found hardest to give him credit for. There is no letter of his to a friend from those weeks. He had not, so far as any search has ever discovered, written a letter of his own hand in 7 years. There is no diary. He was not a diary keeper even when he could see to hold a pen. What we have is his evidence at the Old Bailey 2 months later, given from the witness box in that even Kentish accent he had never lost, and it is from that evidence, sifted line by line, that this fortnight of his suspicions is reconstructed. He did not say, in the witness box, that he had suspected murder. He said that he had begun, from about the 8th of November, to feel that something in his house had gone out of its right shape. That is the phrase he used. Out of its right shape. You will forgive me, I hope, for finding in that phrase more history than in a whole shelf of the pamphlets that were printed about his wife's murder in the weeks after the verdict. The second thing William noticed was the letters. His daughter Emma, at Woolwich, wrote to her mother once a week, on a Sunday evening after the children were in bed, on a sheet of blue notepaper, folded in 3 and sealed with a wafer. The letters came to William Street on the first post of a Tuesday morning, and it had been the habit of the house for years that William, sitting in the parlour with a cup of tea by his elbow, would hold the envelope in his hand and turn it over, and then Mary Ann would come in from the scullery in her apron and read the letter aloud to him in her steady, low voice, standing at the parlour window for the light. When Mary Ann had gone up to her bed and did not come down again, the letters went on arriving on the Tuesday morning, and Louisa, coming down from the sick-room with the dish of leftover breakfast, would pick them up from the mat and put them, unopened, into the pocket of her apron, and would say to William at the parlour door that she would read the letter up to Mary Ann herself and would bring word down of what Emma had to say. William, who had trusted her without a second thought all through October, thanked her for it in October. In the middle of November, he began, without altogether knowing he was doing it, to listen very hard to what she came back down and said. What she came back down and said, on the Tuesday of the 14th, was that Emma sent her love, and that little Sarah had cut a new tooth, and that the weather in Woolwich had been very wet. What she came back down and said on the Tuesday of the 21st was that Emma sent her love, and that little Sarah's tooth was through nicely, and that the weather in Woolwich had been very wet. William could no longer see well enough to read a letter, but he had had ears in his head for 69 years, and the ear of a former constable is a particular instrument. He had heard, in the course of those 2 Tuesdays, almost the same paragraph twice. He thought, that Tuesday evening, about asking to have the letters put into his hand, so that he might feel the folds of them and know for himself that they existed. He did not ask. It seemed to him then an ungentlemanly thing to ask of a woman who was tending his wife around the clock, and had reddened her own hands in the wash-tub over his wife's sheets. He kept the thought to himself, and he sat that evening a good deal longer than usual by the parlour fire before he went up to his own bed. Sit with me a moment, because I want you to understand something about a man of William's age and William's kind. He had spent 31 years in a uniform coat, and in 31 years he had learned that most of what looks like a crime is not, and that most of what does not look like a crime is not either, and that the trick of the trade is to hold both those truths in the head at the same time, without letting either of them harden. He had walked a beat in the streets around the Woolwich Arsenal in the 1840s and the 1850s. He had seen picked pockets and broken windows and the occasional knife on a Saturday night outside a public house, and he had learned the very great difference between a suspicion that is worth acting on and a suspicion that is only the tiredness of a man at the end of a long shift. He was, in those middle November days, holding a suspicion of the second kind, and waiting to see if it would harden into the first. He did not yet know that it would. The third thing William noticed was the tea. Louisa, in the last week of October and the first 3 weeks of November, had taken over the making of the tea in the house entirely. She made it in the black japanned pot with the chipped spout that had stood on the range for as long as anyone in William Street could remember, and she carried it into the parlour on the tray with the 2 willow pattern cups, and she poured it for William at his chair with the same modest attention she had brought to everything else in the house since she had come. William took his tea in the way of his generation, which was strong and very sweet, with 3 lumps of the loaf sugar dropped in from the little pair of pincers on the tray, and stirred with the horn spoon that had been a wedding present 41 years before. On the evening of the 17th of November, sitting by the fire after Louisa had gone up with the broth, William lifted the cup to his mouth and drank, and the taste of the tea was not the taste of the tea. There was a sweetness in it that was not the sweetness of the sugar. It was a duller thing, and it lay a moment on the back of his tongue after the mouthful had gone down, and it left, when it lifted, a fine dry film like the film left by a pinch of chalk. He set the cup down on the little pie-crust table beside his chair. He sat for perhaps a quarter of an hour, with his hand on the arm of the chair and his head a little forward, thinking. Then he lifted the cup again, and he took a second small mouthful. The dullness was still there. He did not, on that evening, say anything about it to anyone. He rose from his chair a little before 9. He climbed the narrow stairs by the wall side, with his stiff hand along the banister. He passed the closed door of the back bedroom, from behind which came the low sound of Louisa reading aloud from a well-thumbed prayer book. He went into his own room at the front of the house, and he shut the door, and he sat for a long time in the dark on the edge of the mattress with his boots still on his feet. I have never been able to say, on the evidence, what William Tregillis in that hour believed. He did not, in the witness box, say that he had believed his wife was being poisoned. He said that he had believed something in the house was wrong. I have wondered, from 100 readings of his testimony, whether the truth is that he could not yet permit himself to name what the wrongness was, because to name it would have required him to think a thought about the woman in the room across the passage, that a man of his upbringing was not able to think without a great deal of proof standing in front of him first. I have wondered, too, whether the taste on his tongue that evening had frightened him not chiefly for himself, but for the woman upstairs, because a former constable knows, if anyone in a parish knows, that a hand which puts a strange sweetness into one cup will not have stopped at that cup only. What he did about it the next morning is what he did about it. What he thought about it in the dark of that room I do not know, and I would rather leave the dark of that room the dark it was. The morning of the 18th was a Saturday. William came down at his usual hour. He took his breakfast in the parlour at the round mahogany table, with Louisa moving about him in her plain print apron, and he said nothing about the tea of the night before. He waited until Louisa had gone up the stairs with the tray for Mary Ann's morning draught, and he stood, and he took his stick from the hall stand, and he opened the front door and went down the whitened step and out into William Street. He walked, because he did not trust his legs any more, with a longer distance than he could measure by the count of his steps, only as far as the corner. At the corner of William Street and Herbert Road stood a lamp-post, and, 5 doors down along Herbert Road, the surgery of a young physician named Wiley, who had come into practice in the parish the previous spring, and who had a good name among the wives of the terrace for a soft hand at a fever. William did not much know him. William had not been in a surgery of any kind for 6 years. But young Dr. Wiley was 5 doors away, and Dr. Saunders, who had been Mary Ann's own physician for a decade, was a mile off up in Woolwich, and had already, as William now saw it, been in the house 4 times without noticing whatever it was that William's tongue had noticed the night before. And so it was to the door of the surgery on Herbert Road that William Tregillis went that morning, 5 doors from the corner, and rang the bell with the head of his stick, and asked the girl who opened it if the doctor could be spared for half an hour to come round to a house on William Street to sit with an old wife who was not doing well. Dr. Wiley came. He was a slight man in his early 30s, in a black frock coat that had gone a little green at the seams, with a neat brown beard and a voice pitched low for the sick room. He carried a leather bag. He walked back with William along the wet pavement in the middle of the morning, and William, whose eyes had not seen a face clearly in a matter of years, walked beside him with his hand not on the doctor's arm, but on his own stick, because he did not wish anyone at a parlour window to see him being led. They came to the whitened step of the second house from the end of the terrace. William turned the key in the lock himself. He held the door open for the doctor. He stood aside in the narrow passage as Dr. Wiley set down his bag on the hall stand and unwound the muffler from his neck. And then, in a voice so low that Louisa, coming out onto the landing at the top of the stairs with the empty broth cup in her hand, did not at first catch the words of it, he asked the doctor if he would be so good as to step up and take a look at his wife, who had been ailing now these 3 weeks past, and about whom he had, he said, 1 or 2 questions he had begun to want an answer to. At the top of the stairs, on the landing outside the closed door of the back bedroom, Louisa stood entirely still with the cup in her hand. The lamp on the small chest of drawers behind her was not yet lit for the morning. The 4 folded packets of white paper tied with fine cotton string lay, undisturbed, in the top drawer at her back. She heard the doctor set his foot on the first stair. She heard the second stair take his weight. She heard William, behind him, close the front door against the cold of the street. The death and the post-mortem. I'll draft Chapter 8 now, keeping continuity with the November timeline set by Chapters 6 and 7, rather than the outline's October reference, so the facts remain internally consistent. Come back with me to the landing of the house on William Street, if you will, because there is a doctor on the stair and a wife in a widow's apron holding an empty cup, and everything that has been true of that house for the last month is about to stop being true. I want you to notice, before we go into the bedroom with Dr. Wiley, how ordinary the fittings of that landing were. The strip of drugget along the boards, the oil lamp on the pine chest, the framed print of a Kentish seashore that had hung there since William and Mary Ann had first taken the lease. the 4 folded packets of white paper in the top drawer, at the back on the right-hand side, under the paper of pins. None of it looked like the scene of a killing. Very little of what a killing is done in ever does. Dr. Wiley was, as I have already told you, a young physician of little more than 3 years in his own practice. But he had been trained at Guy's Hospital across the river, and Guy's, in the last of the 1870s, had been one of the very few teaching hospitals in the country where a house pupil was made to sit through a full course on the industrial poisons before he was let loose upon the wards. He had seen, as a dresser under an older physician, 2 men from a white lead works at Millwall carried in with the wrist drop of their trade, and he had watched the same physician turn back the lower lip of each man and show the students the fine blue-grey line along the gum where it met the teeth. He had never forgotten that line. It was the first thing, on the morning of the 18th of November, that he thought of when Louisa opened the bedroom door for him and stood aside. He asked her, in the low voice he kept for a sick room, to bring up a fresh candle. She went down the stairs to fetch it. In the half-minute she was gone, he crossed to the bedside, and he laid the back of 2 fingers against Mary Ann's forehead, and he lifted the lid of one eye with his thumb and looked at the white of it in the grey light from the window, and he turned back the lower lip with a fingertip and looked at the gum. The line was there. It ran along the whole length of the lower jaw, and it was the colour of a smear of pencil lead rubbed into paper. He set the lip back very evenly, so that the sleeping woman would not know she had been examined, and he stood beside the bed with his hands at his sides and waited for the footstep on the stair. When Louisa came back with the candle, he took it from her with a nod of thanks. He held it above the face on the pillow. He looked once more at the mouth, and then at the fingernails laid on top of the quilt, and then at the fine bones of the wrist where the sleeve of the nightdress had ridden up. He said nothing that could have been overheard on the landing. He asked, in the tone of a man making the polite inquiries of a first call, how long Mrs. Tregillis had been unable to sit up, and what the mixture on the bedside table was, and who had been prescribing it. Louisa answered him steadily. Dr. Saunders of Woolwich. Magnesia and rhubarb. A little laudanum for the pain in the wrists. The mixture was made up at Mr. Cheeseman's on the High Street, and she had been fetching it herself for 3 weeks. Dr. Wiley thanked her. He took up the bottle from the bedside table, and he unstoppered it, and he held it under his nose for perhaps 5 seconds, and he put the stopper back and set the bottle down where it had stood. He did not, in that moment, say what he had smelled. He said only that he would like, if it could be arranged, to see Mrs. Tregillis again in the evening, and that he would in the meantime send a note round to Dr. Saunders in Woolwich. Let me sit with you a moment before we go any further, because I want to be honest with you about what Dr. Wiley could and could not do in that hour. He could not, on the strength of a grey line at a gum and an unfamiliar sweetness in a physic bottle, denounce a nurse to a husband. That was not the medicine of the parish in the 1880s. He could not send for the police from the front step. He could not, without a chemical test he did not have the means to perform in a surgery on Herbert Road, prove to himself that what he suspected was so. What he could do, and what he did do, was to write a note. He wrote it in the parlour of the house on William Street, at the little pie-crust table beside William's chair, with a pen borrowed from a drawer of the parlour bureau, and he sealed it with a wafer from his own pocket-book, and he addressed it to Dr. Saunders at his surgery in Woolwich, and he gave it into the hand of the milkman's boy on the front step, with a penny for his trouble. What he wrote in it has not survived. What Dr. Saunders answered has not survived either. It is one of the small holes in the record, and I will not try to fill it in with a guess. Dr. Wiley came back to the house at 7 that evening. He came back at 9 the next morning. He came back on the afternoon of the 20th. On each of those calls he sat by the bedside for a quarter of an hour, and did very little that Louisa, standing at the door of the room with her hands folded at her waist, could see him doing. He held Mary Ann's wrist for the pulse. He watched the rise and fall of the sheet over her chest. He listened, once, at the mouth. He said, going down the stairs on the 20th of November with William at the parlour door, that he was afraid Mrs. Tregillis was very poorly indeed, and that he did not think she would leave her bed again and that the family in Woolwich might wish to be sent for. Emma came that same evening in a hansom cab, and the 4 children were left with a neighbour in Beresford Square, and Emma climbed the narrow stairs of the house on William Street and sat down in the plain rush chair beside her mother's bed, and she held her mother's hand, which was very cold at the fingers now, and had gone almost the colour of the ink on a letter that has been rained on. She sat there through the night. Louisa sat with her, on the other side of the bed, in the wooden chair with the rag cushion, and neither woman said much, and the candle between them burned down through its own tallow in a long, soft trickle, and was replaced from the drawer of the pine chest on the landing at 3 in the morning. William came up the stairs twice in that night, and he sat at the foot of the bed for a quarter of an hour each time, and he held his wife's foot through the quilt in the shy way he had never quite grown out of, and he went down again to the parlour and the fire. Mary Ann Tregillis died between 4 and 5 in the morning of the 22nd of November, 1882. There was no last word. There was a change in the breathing, and then a longer gap between 2 breaths, and then a longer one, and then the room was as still as the street outside, where a lamplighter was already going along Herbert Road, putting the gas lamps out one by one. Emma laid her mother's hand back on top of the quilt. Louisa rose from her chair on the other side, and drew the sheet up to the chin in the way a nurse of her generation was taught to do. She said, in a voice that had no shake in it at all, that the poor soul was at peace. Emma, whose grief had not yet caught up with her, thanked her. The 2 women went down the stairs together to tell the old man in the parlour that his wife of 41 years had gone. I want to stop at this point and tell you what I know and what I do not know about the hour that followed, because it is the hour in which everything turned. Dr. Wiley was fetched again before it was fully light. He came into the room at about 7. He examined the body. He did not at once sign the certificate of death. He asked William, in the parlour afterwards, whether he might have leave to speak with Dr. Saunders in Woolwich before the certificate was made out, and he said he thought it right, given 1 or 2 features of the case, that there should be a post-mortem examination of Mrs. Tregillis before the funeral was arranged. William, sitting in his chair beside a fire that had burned low in the night, said, in a voice that was steadier than the doctor had expected, that he would be much obliged. Louisa, standing in the parlour doorway with her hands folded and her face composed for the grief of the household, said nothing at all. The post-mortem was carried out the following afternoon, in a mortuary of yellow London brick, behind the workhouse in Woolwich, by Dr. Saunders and Dr. Wiley together, with a mortuary attendant in a leather apron in attendance, and a police surgeon of the R Division of the Metropolitan Police, looking on from a stool by the window. The room was very cold. The window was set high in the wall, and gave onto the yard where a mortuary van stood with its shafts on the cobbles. There was a stone slab in the middle of the room with a channel cut around its edge, and Mary Ann had been laid upon it under a covering of coarse linen, and the linen was drawn back by the attendant with the professional evenness of a man who had drawn it back many hundreds of times before. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of... It was work of the kind such doctors did in such rooms in every parish in the kingdom in that decade, and it does not need a further pamphlet in this world to record it. I will tell you only what they found. They found a stomach whose lining had gone the pale grey of the inside of an oyster shell, and about the edge of the greater curvature of the same stomach, a fine white deposit, which the police surgeon at the window, coming across for a closer look with a lens borrowed from Dr. Wiley's pocket, said in a voice of complete quiet that he had seen once before in the body of a paint mixer at Millwall. They found a liver mottled with pale patches that had no business being there in the liver of a woman of 68 who had never worked in a trade with metals. They found, when the intestine was opened, a further fine deposit of the same white grain along a stretch of the upper bowel. And they took, into 3 glass jars stoppered with cork and sealed with a red wax stamp of the R Division, a portion of the stomach and a portion of the liver, and a small quantity of the contents of the bowel, and the jars were labelled in Dr. Wiley's own hand, with the name of the dead woman, and the date and the initials of the 3 men present. And the jars were carried away that same evening to the offices of Dr. Thomas Stevenson at Guy's Hospital across the river, who was the Home Office analyst for such cases and who was known to the police surgeon by his work in 3 earlier trials. Dr. Stevenson wrote his report a fortnight afterwards. It ran to 7 pages in a neat, sloping hand. It set out, in the plain arithmetic of the analyst's trade, that the stomach of Mary Ann Tregillis had contained 1 1/5 grains of the acetate of lead at the hour of her death, that the liver had contained a further 2 1/4 grains of the same salt distributed through its substance, and that the bowel had contained traces of the same. It set out, in a paragraph that would afterwards be read aloud in a court of law, and would sit in the ear of a jury for the rest of their lives, that a dose of that order, present in those organs in that distribution, could not have arrived there by accident, and could not have arrived there in a single administration, and could only have arrived there by the repeated giving of the same salt in a mixture over a period of some weeks. Dr. Stevenson signed the report. He sealed it. He sent 1 copy to the coroner of the district of Woolwich, and 1 copy to the office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and 1 copy to Superintendent Hazel of the R Division of the Metropolitan Police, whose station stood in Beresford Square, not a mile from the house on William Street. Come out with me now, into the yard behind the mortuary, because the day is going. The van has been backed to the door. The linen has been drawn up again. Mary Ann Tregillis will lie 1 more night in the cold room behind the workhouse in Woolwich, and in the morning she will be carried in a plain elm coffin to the burying ground at Plumstead Common, and her name will be cut into a stone that a passer-by can still find, if he knows where to look, in the older part of that ground today. William Tregillis, standing at his own front door in William Street, on the evening of the post-mortem, with a black crape band newly tied about the sleeve of his coat, does not yet know what has been written in Dr. Stevenson's neat sloping hand. Louisa, folding a mourning cloak over her arm at the top of the stairs, and preparing to walk with the widower in the funeral procession the following morning, does not yet know either. A superintendent of police in a dark serge tunic is at that hour reading the report at his desk in Beresford Square by the light of a green-shaded lamp, and he is turning the pages 1 by 1, and he is drawing toward him, from a wire basket at his elbow, a fresh sheet of foolscap, and the pen with which he will begin to write the warrant. The trial at the Old Bailey. Come with me across the river now, if you will let me, because the story has left the parish of Plumstead, and it will not come back to it until the very last morning. The winter of 1882 closed in over London in a rolling brown fog that thickened at the ends of the streets and turned the gas lamps into pale flowers of light, and it was into that fog, on a raw Monday of the middle of December, that a black police van was driven out of the yard of Newgate Prison and up the short slope to the door of the Central Criminal Court, where the Old Bailey stood, as it had stood for 100 years, its walls black with the soot of the river and its narrow windows barred with iron. Louisa Taylor, in the same widow's black she had worn on every day of her nursing, of Mary Ann Tregillis, and with her hair drawn back beneath a bonnet of black straw, was handed down from the van by 2 matrons of the prison, and she walked between them along a stone passage lit by a single gas jet, and she was brought up by a narrow iron stair into the dock of No. 1 Court. I will pause here and admit a gap in the record. The books that follow this trial forward into our own century do not agree on the exact hour at which the doors of No. 1 Court were opened to the public on that Monday morning, and they do not agree on the number of members of the press who were let in to sit at the long oak table beneath the bench. What they do agree on is that the court was full before the judge came in, and that a large part of the room had been given over to women in mourning dresses of their own, come from as far as Greenwich and Bermondsey, to look upon the widow of William Street. The judge who took his place upon the bench that morning was Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, a man of large frame and heavy brow, in the scarlet and ermine of a judge of the Queen's Bench. He was in his 53rd year. He had been on the bench 3 years. He was known through the profession for a steady patience with witnesses and for a plainness of address to a jury that many older judges had not been able to match. He arranged his papers upon the ledge before him. He nodded to the clerk of arraigns. The clerk rose in his black gown, and he read the indictment in the voice of a man who had read many indictments in the same room, and the indictment charged Louisa Jane Taylor, widow, that she had on divers days between the 10th of October and the 22nd of November in the year 1882, feloniously, wilfully, and of her malice aforethought, administered to Mary Ann Tregillis a certain deadly poison, called the acetate of lead, whereof the said Mary Ann Tregillis had languished and died. Sit with me a moment. I want you to understand what a jury in a room like that was being asked to do, because the fact of it is easy to miss at a distance of 140 years. There was no fingerprint yet in a British court. There was no photograph of an act. There was no test that could put a hand upon a jar in a bedroom and say the hand that had held it last had been the hand of the woman in the dock. What there was in that court on that Monday morning of December was a chain of small, ordinary things, and the question the jury was to answer was whether those things linked one to the next without a break, or whether they did not. The first day of the trial belonged to the chemists of Plumstead and Woolwich. Mr. Cheeseman of the High Street was called first. He came into the witness box in a black frock coat that had been brushed for the occasion, and he told the court, in a voice that carried well over the heads of the barristers, that he had known the prisoner by sight since the middle of October, and that she had come into his shop upon 4 separate occasions in the 4 weeks that followed, and that she had asked upon each occasion for an ounce of the sugar of lead, and that he had wrapped the packet in white paper, and had entered the sale in the poisons book at the counter, where the ledger now lay open at the page for the buyers of the parish to see. He was asked by counsel for the Crown whether he had thought at the time that there was anything odd in the request. He said, in the honest way of a shopkeeper who had thought about the question a great deal since, that he had not. He said that a widow buying an ounce of the sugar of lead for a lotion for a bruise was a thing he had wrapped up in white paper 100 times over the course of 30 years behind his counter. The counsel for the defence rose. He asked no more of Mr. Cheeseman than that he confirm this. He sat down again. The chemist from Herbert Road came next, and then the chemist from Sandy Hill Lane, and then a fourth from a shop across the water at Blackwall whose name Louisa had not, so far as anyone in Plumstead had known, been across the river to give. Each of them stood in his turn in the witness box, and each of them said, in the plainer or the more polished English of his own trade, that the prisoner had come into his shop and had asked for a packet of the acetate of lead, and had paid for it in coin, and had gone out again. By the end of the first afternoon the jury had heard, from 4 separate men who had never met one another, of 6 separate purchases spread across the 7 weeks between the middle of October and the middle of November, each of an ounce, each in a white paper wrapper. 6 ounces of the sugar of lead is a very great deal. It is enough to poison a household. It is a very great deal more, as one counsel remarked in the course of the following morning, than any lotion for a bruise on a widow's own wrist has ever called for in the history of the parish. Come out of the courtroom with me a moment, into the paved lane behind the Old Bailey, where the reporters of the evening papers were writing up their notes in shorthand pencil on scraps of paper folded against the stone of the wall. The fog had not lifted all day. The gas lamps along Newgate Street were already lit at 4 in the afternoon, and their light was a heavy yellow, and the reporter's breath went up into it in thin trails as they wrote. The story of the Widow of Plumstead was, by that Monday evening, in every last edition of every paper in London, and it would run through the trial, and past the verdict, and past the morning at Maidstone. I have read those columns from the microfilm of the British Museum Library, and I will tell you honestly that a great many of them are not the kind of writing I would want to defend at any length. They were not written to be defended. They were written to be sold on the corner of Fleet Street for a halfpenny before the fog thickened again. The second day of the trial belonged to the doctors. Dr. Saunders was called first. He was a man in his 60s, in a black coat cut a little long in the tails in the older fashion, and he told the court that he had attended Mary Ann Tregillis 4 times in the course of her illness, and that upon each of those 4 occasions he had believed himself to be treating a woman of 68 suffering from a slow disorder of the stomach, and that he had prescribed, in the ordinary way, a mixture of magnesia and rhubarb with a little laudanum for the pain. He said, and it cost him plainly a great deal to say it, that he had not thought of poison, and that he was very sorry now that he had not. Dr. Wiley was called after him. He was younger, and he was clearer, and he told the court in the plain, even voice of a man who had rehearsed nothing, that he had been called into the house on the morning of the 18th of November by the husband of the sick woman, and that he had turned back the lower lip of Mrs. Tregillis at her bedside, and had seen upon the gum the fine blue-grey line that he had first been shown as a house pupil at Guy's Hospital, and that the line had told him what a lifetime at the bedside might not otherwise have told him for another week. Dr. Thomas Stevenson was the last of the medical men. He came into the witness box in the black gown of an analyst, with the 7 pages of his report in his hand, and he read to the jury from the plain arithmetic of the trade, and he set out for them, in the same neat, sloping figures in which he had written the report a fortnight before, that the stomach of Mary Ann Tregillis had held 1 1/5 grains of the acetate of lead at the hour of her death, and that the liver had held a further 2 1/4 grains distributed through its substance, and that the bowel had held further traces of the same. He was asked by the counsel for the Crown whether a dose of that order, present in those organs in that distribution, could have arrived there by any means other than the repeated giving of the salt in a mixture over some weeks. He answered, in a voice pitched to the last row of the public gallery, that it could not. The 3rd day of the trial belonged to the household. William Tregillis was helped up into the witness box by a court officer, and he stood with his hand upon the ledge in front of him, and he gave his evidence in the even Kentish accent he had never lost, and he told the court about the weight of the coppers in his Morocco purse on the 8th of November, and about the sameness of the 2 letters from Emma at Woolwich on the 14th and the 21st, and about the dull sweetness on the back of his tongue in the tea of the evening of the 17th. He was not asked, upon the record, whether he had believed in any of those hours that his wife of 41 years was being poisoned in the room across the passage. He said, in the plainest sentence of his whole evidence, that he had believed only that something in his house had gone out of its right shape. Emma was called after him. She told the court about the hansom cab and the 4 children left with a neighbour in Beresford Square, and the plain rush chair beside her mother's bed. She wept once, and no more, and she was let down out of the box. I want to be honest with you here as well. Louisa Taylor did not go into the witness box. Under the law of the day, a prisoner at the bar in a felony trial was not permitted to give sworn evidence in her own defence, and though there was already, in the closing of the year 1882, a movement in the profession to change that law, the change would not come for another 16 years. What her counsel offered, in her stead, was a short address to the jury, in which he asked them to remember that no man and no woman had ever seen his client's hand upon the mixture in the bottle upon the bedside table, and that the chain of the sugar of lead through the 4 chemists' shops proved only that a widow had bought it, and did not prove of itself that a widow had given it. It was, if you will let me put it plainly, the argument that was left to him after every other argument had been closed off by the evidence. Sir James Fitzjames Stephen summed up on the afternoon of the 3rd day. He spoke for 2 hours and a quarter. He set out the case for the Crown fairly, and he set out the case for the defence fairly, and he told the jury, in the plain sentence for which he was known through the profession, that if they could see a way in which the 6 white paper packets and the blue-grey line at the gum and the report of Dr. Stevenson could all be true and the prisoner still be innocent of the charge, then they must acquit her, and that if they could not see any such way, then they must convict. He drew his robes about him. He waited. The jury went out at a little before 5 in the afternoon. They came back in at 20 minutes past 6. They had, by the count of the shorthand writers at the press table, been out 1 hour and 20 minutes exactly. The foreman rose in his place. The clerk of arraigns rose in his. The clerk asked, in the form of words that had not changed in that court for 100 years, whether the jury found the prisoner at the bar guilty or not guilty. The foreman answered, in a voice that carried without effort to the back of the gallery, that they found her guilty. Come out with me now, into the fog of Newgate Street, because the day is going and there is not a great deal more to tell. The black cap was placed upon Sir James Fitzjames Stephen's wig. He passed the sentence of the court in the words of the statute. Louisa Taylor was carried down the iron stair by the same two matrons who had brought her up it on the Monday morning, and she was driven back through the fog to Newgate, and in due course she was transferred by rail to the county gaol at Maidstone, where the sentence of the court would be carried out. William Tregillis went home alone on the last train from Charing Cross to Woolwich. The lamp of a corner beer shop threw its light onto the wet pavement as he turned into William Street. The parlour window of the second house from the end of the terrace was dark. He let himself in at the door with his own key. He sat down in his chair beside a fire that no one had laid for him, and somewhere in the county of Kent, in a whitewashed cell of the female wing of Maidstone Gaol, a candle was already burning down beside a plain wooden table, and the last days of a widow's life had, without her yet altogether knowing it, begun their count. The final descent. Come with me down into Kent now, if you will let me, for the last time in this telling, because the sentence has been passed and the county gaol at Maidstone is not the Old Bailey, and the fog of Newgate Street has been left behind on the far side of the river. The train that carried Louisa Taylor out of London on the morning after her conviction ran through the flat country south of Blackheath and past the frost-white orchards of the North Downs, and it set her down in a covered van at a siding, a short walk from the gaol wall. She was taken in through a side door in a wall of yellow ragstone. She was signed for by the Deputy Governor at a desk in the receiving room. She was walked between two wardresses in the dark blue serge of the female wing, along a whitewashed passage in which each footfall carried a long way, and she was locked in a cell on the ground floor of that wing, where a plank bed stood along one wall, and a straw mattress lay upon the plank bed, and a wooden stool stood beside the door. I want to be honest with you, before we go a step further. The records of the 4 weeks that Louisa Taylor spent in that cell between the closing days of December 1882 and the 2nd of January 1883 are thinner than the record of any other stretch of her life. The condemned book of the jail for that winter has not come down to us in a shape I have been able to consult. The papers of the chaplain who attended her do not survive, so far as I know, in any archive I have been able to find. What I have to work from is a page in the register of the gaol that gives her name and her sentence and the date of her admission, a paragraph in a Kentish paper of the last week of December that reports she was eating little, and a scatter of second-hand accounts written many years afterwards that I would not lean upon for any fact I could not find elsewhere. So there will be silences in this last hour of the telling, and I would rather sit inside them honestly than fill them with a guess. What can be said is this. The cell was cold. The whitewash on the walls carried the damp of a winter that had been raw since the middle of November. A single square window, high in the wall, gave upon a courtyard of grey flagstones and a strip of grey Kentish sky. The wardresses who sat with the prisoner in shifts of 8 hours through the day and the night were forbidden by the standing orders of the wing to speak with her upon any subject other than the ordinary needs of the body. A tin plate of bread and a tin cup of thin tea were brought in at 7 in the morning, and at noon, and at 6 in the evening. The chaplain of the gaol came into the cell once each day and read the appointed passages of the prayer book, and offered such other consolations as a clergyman of the Church of England of that decade was trained to offer to a woman in a condemned cell. Sit with me a moment. I want you to imagine, if you can bear to, the shape of the hours in that room. It is not the same shape as the hours of the free. The wardress sits upon the wooden stool by the door. The prisoner sits upon the plank bed against the wall. Neither of them speaks. The bell of the gaol chapel sounds the quarters through the day and the night. The wardress is relieved at 3 in the afternoon, and at 11 at night, and at 7 in the morning, and the woman who takes her place sits down upon the same stool and folds her hands in the same way in her lap. Outside the wall of the gaol, the market town of Maidstone goes about the business of a Kent county town in the last week of the old year. A milk cart rattles along Week Street. The bell of All Saints across the river sounds the hour with its own voice. The Christmas of 1882 comes and goes without any mark within the walls of the female wing beyond a carol sung by the chaplain in the corridor on the morning of the 25th. Come back with me for a moment to Plumstead, because there are two other people in this story whose lives after William Street ought to be spoken of before the bell of Maidstone tolls. William Tregillis, the widower of the house on the terrace, went on living in that same parlour, with the pie-crust table beside his chair, and the black crape band went on being tied around the sleeve of his coat, and the neighbours who spoke of him in the years that followed said that he sat most evenings by the parlour fire with a book of psalms open upon his knee and the lamp turned low. How many years he outlived his wife I cannot tell you with certainty. The parish records for that stretch of Plumstead are patchy, and the surname is a common one, but he is not in the census returns of the turn of the new century, and so the answer is a matter of some years and not a matter of many. He was buried, when his time came, in the same plot of the burying ground at Plumstead Common in which Mary Ann had been laid down, and the two names may still be read upon the softened stone by a passer-by who knows where to look. Emma, his daughter, who had sat by her mother's bed on the night of the 21st of November and had held her hand through the last hour, went back to Woolwich with her 4 children the day after the funeral, and she raised them there in the house near Beresford Square, where she had lived as a young married woman. What she thought in the years afterwards of the woman in the plain rush chair on the other side of her mother's bed, no letter of hers that I have found has told us. It is one of the silences of this story that I have grown, over the writing of it, most to respect. She sat one whole night beside a bed in which her mother was being killed, and she held the memory of the killer's forbearance beside her own for the rest of her life, and she did not, so far as any surviving paper tells us, speak of it aloud again. Come with me now to the morning of the 2nd of January, 1883. It had frozen hard in the night. The pavements of Week Street were white with the frost, and the puddles in the yard behind the gale had a skin of ice across them that a warder broke through with the heel of his boot when he went out at 6 to see that the shed was in order. The shed stood in the far corner of the yard, against the inner wall of the gale. It was a low building of yellow ragstone, roofed with slate, and it held within it the beam and the trap and the coil of rope that were the working parts of the sentence of the court. The rope had been fixed the evening before by the executioner, who had come down from Lincolnshire on the last train of the 31st, and had taken his supper in the governor's lodging within the walls. I will name him for you, because he is a matter of the public record. His name was William Marwood, and he was in his 65th year, and he had held the office of executioner for the counties of England for 11 years, and he had come to it late in life from the trade of cobbler in the town of Horncastle in Lincolnshire. He had, over those 11 years, made himself the study of the arithmetic of his work, and he had brought into the country the method that came afterwards to be known by his name, in which the length of the drop was calculated from the weight of the prisoner, and the mercy of a swift end was made a matter of a table of figures rather than of guesswork. He was a heavy-set man in a dark coat, and he spoke little to anyone within the walls, and he had been up since before 5 in the morning going over his work in the shed by the light of a bull's-eye lantern. The chaplain came into Louisa's cell at 7:15. She was already dressed. She had asked, in the hour before, for a cup of tea, and it had been brought to her, and she had drunk about half of it, and she had set the cup down upon the stool by the plank bed and had not touched it again. She listened to the chaplain read the appointed office for the morning. She said the responses, according to the warder who was present, in a voice that was clear, though whether that word carries the meaning of calm or only the meaning of audible is a thing I cannot tell you from this distance. She rose from the plank bed. She walked, between the chaplain in his surplice and 2 wardresses in dark blue serge, along the whitewashed passage of the female wing, and out through a doorway into the frost-white yard. The under-sheriff of the county was waiting in the yard with his warrant. The surgeon of the gaol was waiting beside him. The bell of the chapel had begun its slow tolling at 5 minutes to 8, and it went on tolling in one long single note through what followed. Marwood met her at the door of the shed. He took her arm, in the way he had made his own, in a grip that was firm but not rough. He walked her across the boards of the trap. He drew the white cap down over her face. He set the rope about her neck and adjusted the knot behind the left ear in the placing he had learned to be surest. He stepped back one pace. He drew the lever. "Come away from the yard with me now, because there is nothing else in it that you need to see." The bell of Maidstone Gaol went on tolling for another quarter of an hour in the frost-white air. A crowd that had gathered at the gates in the dark before dawn stood in silence upon the pavement while the black flag was run up on the pole above the gatehouse. The under-sheriff signed the warrant at 8 minutes past the hour. The surgeon signed the certificate of death. The body of Louisa Taylor was taken down from the beam and was laid in a plain coffin of deal, and it was buried the same afternoon within the walls of the gaol, in the strip of ground along the inner wall of the north yard, where the unclaimed dead of that institution had been laid down for the whole of that century, and no stone was set above her. I want to say one honest thing before the candle burns down. It was reported in more than one of the papers that carried her story to a close in the first week of January that Louisa Taylor had, in her last days, made a confession of her guilt to the chaplain who attended her. Whether the substance of that confession was ever written down, and whether it named any reason or any accomplice, is a matter on which the surviving record does not agree with itself. Some accounts speak of a full confession. Others speak of an admission only of the giving of the sugar of lead, without a word offered as to why. Others, more sober, say only that she had ceased to protest her innocence in her last week. So the question of why a widow of 43 in a lodging in Plumstead poisoned an old friend in a low bed above a scullery over the course of 7 autumn weeks in 1882 is a question the record does not answer. She took what she knew of herself into the yard behind the shed. She was buried with it under the flagstones of the north wall. The house on William Street stood there through all that followed, and it stands there still if you know the turning to look for. The parish burying ground at Plumstead Common holds Mary Ann under a stone that the weather of many winters has softened almost to a smoothness. The county gaol at Maidstone was rebuilt in part in a later century, and the yard behind the shed is a yard of a different use now, and the strip of ground along the north wall lies under a paving that no one who walks across it has any reason to think about. The 4 white paper packets tied with fine cotton string that once lay in the top drawer of the pine chest on the landing at William Street are dust, if they are anything, in a Kentish field. Sit with me one moment longer, if you will. The fire in the grate beside me has burned down through the last hour of the telling, and the room is still, and outside the window the night has gone as deep as it goes before it begins the slow turn toward morning. I do not know where you are listening from tonight, or what the hour is on your side of the dark, or whether the story has kept you company through a long drive or a long wakefulness, or the last hour of an ordinary evening. I hope, whatever it has been, that it has been a kindness of a sort. Louisa Taylor is a great many winters gone now. Mary Ann Tregillis is a great many winters gone. William at his fireside is gone, and Emma at her window at Woolwich is gone. The lamp on the pine chest on the landing of the house on William Street was blown out by a lodger who did not know its history in the spring of 1883, and it has never in all the years since been relit. The candle beside me is burning down now. The chapel bell of Maidstone has been silent for a long time. The frost is on the fields of Kent, and the frost is on the pavements of Plumstead, and the frost is on the stone above Mary Ann Tregillis at the far end of the older ground on the common. There is nothing more to tell. Sleep well if you can. Sleep gently. And in the morning, when the light comes in at your window, remember that it comes in also over an older world, and over the graves of the small people of that world, and over the quiet places in the record where the truth has folded itself away. Good night. Good night. And the page once again turns in the dark.